Hey, what's going on, Alexander? All right, let's see. Disgraced. I'm going to send you a co-host, so go ahead and accept that. Let's see. All right, okay, there we go. Um, all right, now let me go into the DMs here real quick. And Disgrace, please, if at any point there's bad weather out here in the desert today, so if at any point I start breaking up or something like that, just chime in and let me know because there's never any way of telling here. Okay. All right. So I went ahead and pinned that tweet up there. So for people who don't know, uh, Disgraced and I went on his podcast, and we had just a really great discussion on Zarathustra, and that's really behind a lot of my recent spaces on Nietzsche. Is that I enjoyed it so much when we had that discussion over it, that I thought I'd go back to it. Um, I have to be careful though because again, I don't want to end up uh, pigeonholing myself with too much Nietzsche these days. I really am going to start doing some Melville spaces, and I really want to start doing some Xenophon. Xenophon is just absolutely great, um, and and that'll be good. But let's see. So when we did our discussion on Zarathustra up there in the nest, I think we spent over 2 hours, and we covered. Let's see, we did the chapter on friends, on the friend aspect, and we did the chapter on women, and that's where it really gets interesting because uh, what happens with the chapter on women is that you get a glimpse into what's really going on at the core of the text of Zarathustra, which is this love story between himself and, on the one hand, Life, who's a woman, anthropomorphized, and his wisdom, on the other hand, which is also a woman. And if it's amazing because a lot of times you'll have discussions with people about Zarathustra, and they miss that. They don't pick up on that because it's so funny because the women bicker. They bicker back and forth with each other, and Zarathustra comes to a realization. He's learning, right? He's learning, um, and it has a lot to do with the imagery of philosophy and philosophy itself, or truth being a woman, and what it would mean to Nietzsche for truth to be a woman, as he says in the opening of Beyond Good and Evil. And he also says in Beyond Good and Evil, truth is Kirke. And Kirke, of course, is that famous character from Homer that seduces all his men, turns them into swine. And so the indication there is that something about this pursuit of truth, or philosophy as it's traditionally been understood, has turned men into pigs, something like that. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
let me just add to that in our original talk, you really helped me to understand this love story element to Thus Spake that I hadn't really, for whatever reason, not really digested before. But now that in my own reread, I'm getting into the end of the third section, the last few um, uh chapters of the third section, so like the second dance song, the seven seals, are really some of the more beautiful chapters of the entire thing. Like really inspiring, beautiful. One rhymes, one is like a poetic chapter that has several sections that rhyme, and they're more or less him writing this love poem to life, and sort of saying that he's choosing life over wisdom. Isn't that right, more or less?
Yeah, that really also gets to the most, or I should say, the deepest metaphysical element in Nietzsche's Zarathustra occurs with what he whispers into life's ear, because what he whispers surprises her. Um,
Oh yeah, but we don't know what he whispers, right? It's like
exactly,
it's this thing we don't
exactly.
know. Yeah, it's such an
Yeah,
interesting point. I wanted to
and
ask you about that.
yeah, and one of the things to keep in mind is that throughout the text, and also in a few other places in his publications, uh, he says that he wants nutcrackers, which is to say, you can't necessarily get it. There's no real methodical way to get into things. You just have to have good instincts, right? You guess, right? That's the whole point of the role of the privileging of instincts over the tradition of rationality with with Nietzsche, is that uh, this rationality or reason it's absolutely crucial. I mean, he's perfectly clear about that. But there comes a point when it can only take you so far, and you have to have good taste, or good instincts, and that's what we're going to get into some of that today. Um, I wanted to. One of the things I'm trying to do is not have my spaces go so long as I've been doing before. Like I said, I did one the other day that was like 3.5 hours, which was a disaster, because it just went too long. Uh, and so I think it's helpful if maybe we just. I wanted to do just one section. So disgraced. Hang on. Do me a favor and hit the mute there for me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
It's
no,
if
no, you're
this
good.
loud here.
Nah, you're good. Um, no, so he sent me a list of ones that he's interested in, and in that list was on tarantulas, and I thought it would be best to just go ahead and do one of those that he sent me. And on tarantulas is, I mean, it's just so absolutely fascinating, but important as well, because one of the things that Nietzsche does with his deconstruction of modernity is he criticizes what he refers to variously as the modern ideals, the Enlightenment ideals, and it's in that section on the tarantulas that he goes after the most important of the modern ideals. And it's very, very relevant, because I mean it's going to become immediately clear why it should be relevant, but I'll just sort of give a spoiler here, is that what he has in mind is everything we're seeing with this problem of all the so-called rights, civil rights of people, right? I mean, we're so bogged down with this stuff about trans rights and all that right now. That's going to be made perfectly clear in this section on the tarantulas. Um, and so I just really kind of wanted to focus on that. And it's also, he also brings out very, very good, a lot of the teaching of the psychology that he has in mind behind all these things. And uh, it's going to be resentment. And even more importantly, and he does this all within one chapter, is he points out the difficulties. And this is interesting for there's been some guys doing a space, I think, for like almost 4 days straight now. I don't know. I don't know why, but um, it's been all over the place, and there's always a lot of discussion on Twitter with the so-called the various pagans and the various Christians and things like that. Nietzsche is going to provide his comment on at least modern Christianity in this chapter, and so that again makes it very helpful, and it also includes references to the Greeks. And it just so happened, one of my mutuals, Doug, I love the guy. He's been doing over the last year these Bronze Age mindset reading spaces on Wednesdays or Tuesdays sometimes. And today, I mean, they finished Bronze Age mindset the other week, and today they read Homer's Contest, and it's coming. there's going to be some almost identical lines in this chapter that are presented rather obscurely, like you sort of have to guess, you have to figure out who he's talking about. And there, if you know Nietzsche's writings, then you know it's coming from Homer's Contest. So there's that involved there. Um, and so I will set the stage with a little bit of background because the text itself, you can't just pick it up and read random sections. So I will give it a little bit of background. But Disgrace, did you want to go ahead and add anything to any of that I just said right there?
Not really. I just think we should read it. Did you want to read Rabble first, or should we just go straight into Tarantulas?
Yeah, that's another thing I was going to do. I wanted to make sure that we read this for the people so that they're on the same page with us. And what I wanted to do is I'll start with just a little bit of a section at the very beginning of book two. Now, the thing about Zarathustra is that it's a book about going up and coming down, right? And what happens in book two is he's been away from his disciples. He's left them. Well. Let's in the first part, book one of Zarathustra. First, he has to find disciples, right? In fact, he has to find out that he needs disciples in the first place. He's found out that there is this thing called the herd, um, and from the herd, he has to be a kind of a wolf and steal their best, right? To make them his disciples. He calls them brothers and whatnot. Um, and so then he leaves them, okay? And so then book two begins. Now, book two, you have to always keep in mind epigraphs matter. So book two begins with an epigraph coming from a very important section from book one, from On the Bestowing Virtue. And what it says there for book two is it says, "And only when you have all denied me will I return to you. Indeed, with different eyes, my brothers, will I then seek my lost ones. With different love will I love you then." Um, and then book two begins with what's titled "The Child with the Mirror." Now, I'm working from the Cambridge edition, and I've already found a number of problems here, and we're going to run into some of those in this section with the German word for justice. And also, he has some fun with some puns with the German, but for our practical intents and purposes, we don't have to get too far into that, if at all. But this one begins. It's called "The Child with the Mirror," and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just read the first part so you can understand what's going on in book two. He says it begins, and again, this is the narrator speaking. This text is multi-layered, right? There's a narrator, there's Zarathustra, and you have to ask yourself, okay, where's Nietzsche in all this, right? Uh, but he says, okay, at this time Zarathustra returned again to the mountains and to the solitude of his cave, and withdrew from mankind, waiting like a sower who has cast his seeds. But his soul grew full of impatience and desire for those whom he loved, because he still had much to give them. For this is the hardest thing, to close the open hand out of love and to preserve a sense of shame as a bestower. Um, that's a comment on how many spaces I've done lately. It's like, look, slow down with the spaces you're doing. You're bestowing too much. You're overflowing too much. Uh, he says, "Thus moons and years passed for the lonely one, but his wisdom grew, and its fullness caused him pain." So that's important. So he's been up here years, right? I mean, this is a while. This isn't him just going up to the cave and spending a weekend and saying, "All right, I'm coming back to you guys." He's been up there for years, and it also says again that his wisdom grew. So he's always growing in knowledge, uh, and so that might have an effect on things that have come before. In fact, it will have an effect on things that come before. And he says, "But one morning he awoke already before dawn, reflected for a long time on his bed, and at last spoke to his heart. What frightened me so in my dream that it waked me? Did not a child approach me carrying a mirror? Oh, Zarathustra," spoke the child to me, "look at yourself in the mirror. But when I looked into the mirror, I cried out, and my heart was shaken, for I did not see myself there, but a devil's grimace and scornful laughter. Indeed, all too well I understand the dream's sign and warning. My teaching is in danger. Weeds want to weeds want to be wheat. Uh, Sorry, I was thinking ahead of something. Okay, so well, okay, then this one last sentence. He says, "My friends are lost to me. The hour has arrived to seek my lost ones." So, um, the imagery being used right there is, he says it's a child that comes up to him holding a mirror. Uh, and remember, Zarathustra had already said before he even started giving his speeches after he left the town, he said, "I'll never speak to the people again." And he doesn't. He never speaks to him again. He just speaks to his disciples. Um, so it should be clear from the imagery of the child that those are his disciples. In his dream, what he has seen is that they have come to him, uh, and the imagery of the mirror is his teaching, right? And they're saying, "Look, look what we're doing. Look, we've done. Look what we've done with what you taught us. This is what you taught us." And he says he looks at this and doesn't even recognize himself, right? So something has gone very awry. Um, and so we see again the waywardness that's happening with Zarathustra. Uh, Originally he thought he could just come down and just immediately speak to the entire town, to everyone, and that failed miserably. Uh, then he's tried to get these various disciples, the best of the, I guess we could say, sort of the last men or so, um, and that has failed now too, very badly, because they have, well, we're going to find out in the chapters we read here that with the rabble, and the tarantulas in particular, that there seems to be some syncretism going on here. Uh, and this has been replayed, by the way, in the history of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche knows full well that Zarathustra is going to be greatly misunderstood. In fact, when it comes to America and England in particular, Zarathustra's teaching, and we'll see this immediately. These two sections right here, the rabble and tarantulas, they go together. They're both about Zarathustra's understanding of justice, which is to say, they're about the diffusion of Zarathustra's knowledge into the city, right? Um, and what happened in the West when Nietzsche first arrived is, of course, these kind of things first arise in academia, and academia has mostly always been on the left. Well, certainly since the early 20th century. And that's when Nietzsche arrives sort of on the shores of America. And the first thing that happened was that a lot of the theological seminaries, uh, where we get what's known as like liberal theology from, they swallowed up Nietzsche so much. There were all, I mean, the history of Nietzsche in America is hilarious, as well as, again, Britain. It's hilarious because you even had there were feminists saying that there's an Uber Frau. There's not just an Uber Mensch. There's an Uber Frau, and they used all these things in a sense to try to spread this equality and Nietzsche at the same time. This egalitarianism in Nietzsche. And what we're going to find in these two sections is that just simply doesn't exist, to the extent that the left has variously co-opted Nietzsche throughout. And also, I would add, the right, because that's where the role of Christianity is going to come into play in these chapters, is that when you have Christian Nietzscheans, or Nietzscheans of the left, they're still going to want to have their egalitarianism, what Nietzsche's Zarathustra is going to refer to as the preachers of equality. Um, and that indication there of the religious kind of overtones, the preachers of equality, that's 100% accurate, because that's what's happened in the West. And that's what Nietzsche saw happening in the West, was the way in which these modern ideals of the Enlightenment became so thoroughly diffused within Christianity, whether it was Protestantism or Catholicism, either one, uh, you have this kind of democratization of Christianity, and it becomes very difficult for people to realize, if they're still within the realm of biblical teaching, or if they're thoroughly within the realm of political teachings, secular political teachings. And that's something that's still very, very much with us today. That's why we have the trans flags in the churches. So it's 100% relevant to all of this. Disgrace, did you want to add anything before I jump into the rabble section?
No, not really. Just that, yeah, I mean, what you said about the beginning of this, of part two, is really fascinating. And also, so, I mean, it seems like each of the four sections begins basically with, as you're saying, he's going up and down, up and down, up and down. So he's going into his cave and like studying. I guess in the third section, he actually goes through hell, basically. Um, and then he comes and sort of uh, shares his knowledge that he's gained from his time away. He shares it all, and the rest of that chapter is basically him sharing it through this specific lens. And like the last chapter, section 4 that I'm on now, is him basically in dialogue with Schopenhauer, which is like his the last like boss he has to fight, kind of. Whereas here in the second section, it sounds like what the main like theme, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, is the main theme here is the way in which people pollute his teachings. And this whole section 2 is him dealing with and trying to understand how to make his ideas survive that and get through that. Is that right?
Um, as far as what you were saying about this section, yes, what's going on in section 2 fundamentally is he's had to come back down to rescue his teaching,
Right.
and salvage his friends, if possible, who are the ones who have done the damage to his teaching. Um, it's always our friends that fuck us up the most, right? So,
Right. Right.
okay.
And
Um,
now he in these two chapters so the first he's going to basically say, here's two different groups, and here's how these two different groups pollute my teachings. One is the rabble, and then one is the tarantulas.
I would go a little bit further and say that what we have with these two chapters is the practical and the theoretical.
Mm.
On the practical side of things, you have what the preachers of equality produce in practice. This is how it ends up working out. And then with the tarantulas, those are the theoreticians who are responsible for the ideas of equality being taught and being esteemed and whatnot. So that's how I would say that these two chapters relate together. Is on the one hand, you have the practical consequence of the theoretical itself. So actually, I guess that would be on both hands. So you have the practical consequences of the theoretical going on here.
Okay. All right. Let's go for it. Let's go.
All right. Okay. So this is on the rabble. Now it's worth. Now again, I point out the section just prior to this was on the virtuous. So again, these things are all nested together, and so taking them individually is never entirely accurate. But we can still do some stuff with it, right? Um, because obviously virtue is crucial to all of this discussion. But here he goes. And I'll try to correct some of the more obvious errors in the German as I go. Um, he says, "Life is a well of joy." Now this is on the rabble. So life is a well of joy, but where the rabble also drinks, there all wells are poisoned. I appreciate all that is clean, but I do not like to see the grinning snouts and the thirst of the unclean. They cast their eyes down into the well. Now their disgusting smile reflects back up to me from the well. They have poisoned the holy water with their lustfulness, and when and what they I'm sorry, and when they called their filthy dreams joy, they poisoned even words. Again, very relevant. uh, the flame shrinks when they put their dank hearts on the fire. The spirit itself seethes and smokes wherever the rabble approaches the fire. In their hands, fruit becomes sickly, sweet, and overripe. Their gaze makes fruit trees prone to windfall and wither at the crown. And some who turned away from life. Okay, now what's about to happen here is I think that it should be clear that Zarathustra is going to give us one of those rare glimpses into himself, uh, the pre-Zarathustra, before he went up to the cave with his burned ashes. Right. That's, you always want to really pay attention to the breadcrumbs throughout the text to find out what Zarathustra's life was like before he finally just carried his own dead body basically up into the mountain for convalescence. And here we're going to get some of those breadcrumbs. He says, and some who turned away from life only turned away from the rabble, not wanting to share well and flame and fruit with the rabble. And some who went into the wilderness and suffered thirst with beasts of prey simply did not want to sit around the cistern with filthy camel drivers. I find that particularly hilarious. And he says, and some who came along like annihilators and like a hailstorm to all orchards merely wanted to plant their foot into the maw of the rabble to stuff its throat. Uh, Now, that reference to annihilators right there, that's going to go back very far to the first book, the beginning of the first book, where he talks about the kind of people that he's searching for in these disciples. So this is a comment on his disciples now, is, and we need to really pay attention there, because he's saying that he's saying they're not overmen, right? They're just these kind of foot soldiers. I mean, literally, when he says they just wanted to plant their foot in the maw of the rabble. So very much like Plato, Zarathustra is going to have this kind of teaching that he knows is going to issue into a multi-layered audience to produce different kinds of people. Um, the highest, of course, being the overman, the lowest being just the herd who are uneducable, and then you're going to have these annihilators, as he says, that bring about the free spirits and the in the highest instance the overmen. And he says, and this is a, again, we're coming upon a crucial line. He says, and the bite I gagged on most. It's really the, I think that word should be choked, because he's going to use some repetition here. And the bite I choked on most was not the knowledge that life itself requires hostility and dying and torture crosses. Instead, I once asked and almost choked on my question, what? Does life also require the rabble? And poison wells and stinking fires and soiled dreams and maggots required in life's bread? This is not my hatred, but my nausea fed hungrily on my life. Oh, I often grew weary of the spirit when I found even the rabble had wit. Um, Now, what's happening here is that so very dangerous, well, so very stifling to Zarathustra is going to be that it's not just that the last man exists, but that the last man has to exist. So Zarathustra is not one who's teaching a kind of genocide, because remember, what's going to be the hardest and most difficult aspect of the teaching that he's going to invoke is eternal return of the same. Eternal return of the same does not simply involve your actions in your life, right? It involves the things that cause those actions. And what is it that causes such nausea and sickness with Zarathustra? Well, it's the herd. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is actually something I wanted to ask that I had written down anyway, which is last time you were very clear that Nietzsche is not somebody who believes in good and evil, right? I mean, he doesn't believe in metaphysical or actual good and evil. It's all part of the same life that's worth living, and there's no essence to anything. And that's why you've called him a nihilist, because there's no actual meaning behind these at least traditional concepts of good and evil, right? So what I see here is him saying it's very easy for me to dismiss the notion that all these things in life of stomping on people and dying and martyrs, you know, I know that those things are part of what makes life worth living. And those things are not evil in and of themselves, right? But given my worldview, the thing that I do feel and think of as evil is the rabble, is these preachers of equality, is this rotting, the rotting degenerate edge to things. So what I'm interpreting him saying here is I can swallow the fact that evil is just, not necessarily real, but I can't swallow the fact that the rabble isn't um, inherently bad or like metaphysically wrong.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way that I phrase it. Um, what Zarathustra is having the greatest difficulty accepting here, and the reason I say that he's not one that's promoting any kind of genocide or something like that, is that what is that there's also the greatness here. It's you don't get greatness without great pain, is what's happening, because and the way I phrase it is this: no masters without slaves. In order to have masters, you simply have to have slaves. And that's what Zarathustra has just discovered. It's not going to be this kind of society in which everyone's an overman, or everyone's either an overman or a free spirit, right? And we've gotten away from the herd. The herd always has to be there. Um, Another way we'll see, we're going to see this come up in the tarantula section, and there's even a better way to phrase it with regard to what gets referred to. Nietzsche himself says it is that Christianity is Platonism uh, for for the people, but what he's just realized is that that's not true. Um, and I'll get into that better when we go there. But yes, as far as Nietzsche's own nihilism is concerned, it's subtle, because what it is that there is fundamental becoming, uh, but there's no stability within the flux of anything that has been. What does stay, or stay as long as possible, is the stamping of the values upon the kind of wax of becoming, right? And man gets to decide what those are, whether they're good or whether they're evil. That's what gets to be said. That's what's going to fundamentally distinguish Nietzsche from, for instance, Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's nihilism doesn't run that deep. Uh, for Nietzsche, it does, because he just simply takes as a given the fact that the conclusions of modern science are basically the same. Uh, Pure flux all the way down. Nothing gets anchored at all.
Right. But then well, I'll re ask this question at the end of it. But the question is, if that's true, if it's all flux all the way down, then you can't pin the rabble or the weak or the preachers of equality into the negative column, can you? Right?
Right. That's what he's having the difficulty with,
Yeah, yeah.
is that these are not. It's not something as much. So let me rephrase it. Zarathustra has an understanding of greatness, and the the tragedy about it is that it's not something that can be shared with everyone. And the people it can't be shared with are the vast majority of people. And that's the problem he struggles with. That's what he almost chokes on here, is because in order for that greatness to even have the possibility of any existence, you're going to have the herd. It simply has to happen. Um, and that's going to really come out again when we get to the tarantulas part. So let me just sort of plow through the rest of this, because I think that's pretty much the most important element that comes out of this section. But he says, and he says, I turned my back on the rulers when I saw what they call ruling today, haggling and bartering for power. And then he enters the M dash with the rabble. So, uh, very important subtlety there. It's not haggling and bartering for power that's troubling for Zarathustra. It's that you have to haggle and barter with the rabble for the power, right? Because remember, what Zarathustra's discovery of being is, we could say, is that it's fundamentally will to power. And so, if everything is will to power, then of course you're always going to have strife. Of course, you're always going to have this kind of fundamental contest of human strength. But the problem is that um, when it becomes the purview of the rabble, right? They just, and again, we are firmly in the realm of the modern understanding of democracy. That's what he has in his crosshairs. Things like aristocracy and such, they have what Nietzsche is going to refer to as a rank order, right? What we call a natural order of rank. Um, Democracy doesn't want to allow for that. And so that's why he's so fundamentally concerned with the rabble. Uh, so we'll sort of keep that in mind. And he says, among people of foreign tongues I lived. Now here's more commentary of the pre-Zarathustra. He says, among people of foreign tongues I lived with my ears closed, so that the haggling of their tongue and the bartering for power would remain foreign to me. And holding my nose, I walked annoyed through all yesterday and today. Truly, all yesterday and today smell foul of the writing rabble. Now, I absolutely love that line, because he says, not just the rabble, but of the writing rabble. Uh, One of the things that Nietzsche complains most about modernity is, he says, what used to be great in man was that he would begin the day with prayer, right? In other words, a recognition not simply of greatness, but of the greatest greatness, right? The divine. And he says, but now man has replaced the prayer with the newspaper. And so when he says the writing rabbler, he's talking about those people I love to mock, the scribblers, the people who are constantly scribbling endlessly
Yeah,
about all the latest events.
my translation actually is scribbling,
Yeah,
the scribbling rabble.
I'll have to check. I'll check the German on that. And then he continues further, because he's going to give this threefold ranking here. He says, like a cripple. Now, that's going to be key for Zarathustra coming up, this notion of humans as crippled. He says, like a cripple who became deaf and blind and dumb. Thus I lived for a long time, so as not to live with the power, the scribble, the pleasure rabble. A better way, I think, to have put that. It doesn't come across when I'm reading it, but it's the power rabble, the scribble rabble, the pleasure rabble. So those three things are that's like the trinity of sins among the rabble. And every time we see that word, the rabble, we need to remember he's talking of democracy. And the rabble, previously he mentioned them in the form of the herd. Now they're just the rabble. Um, and the three things they do that bother him the most is they vie for power, they're constantly scribbling, and they're constantly in pursuit of just mere pleasure. So those three things. And he says, laboriously, my spirit climbs steps, and cautiously, alms of joy were its refreshment. For the blind man, life crept by as if on a cane. He says, but what happened to me? How did I redeem myself from nausea? Who rejuvenated my eyes? How did I manage to fly to the height where no more rabble sits at the well? Okay, uh, what he's just mentioned there, redemption. That's crucial. What we're talking about now, what he's talking about now, is how Zarathustra himself apparently overcame nihilism. So, how do you overcome nihilism? And he's giving us these clues right here to it. And this imagery of redemption is crucial. He's going to have an entire chapter on it, closing off the second part of this book. He says, and then he's asking rhetorically. He says, "Did my nausea itself create wings for me and water divining powers? Truly, into the highest regions I had to fly in order to rediscover the wellspring of joy. Oh, I found it, my brothers. Here in the highest regions, the wellspring of joy gushes for me, and there is a life from which no rabble drinks. Almost too forcefully you flow, well of joy, and often you empty the cup again in wanting to fill it. And I must still learn to approach you more modestly. All too forcefully, my heart still streams towards you. My heart upon which my summer burns, the brief, hot, melancholy, super, oh, well, I hate when this translator uses super. It's always better to use over. Over blissful summer. How my summer heart yearns for your coolness. Gone the hesitating gloom of my spring, gone the malice of my snowflakes in June. I have become summer, and summer noon entirely, a summer in the highest regions. So again, he's waxing rhetorically here. And the question though is, what did, he just posed the question. He said, "What was it that I was able that granted me redemption?" And he's not answering that. Uh, he's testing in a way his disciples, right? He's not going to, because remember that's the key to becoming what it means to become a disciple or a brother of Zarathustra, is that he's not just going to grant it to anybody. And very much like that key line we talked about earlier, where you have to the reader has to simply guess what it is that Zarathustra has learned, or the insight he's had that he says to life itself. We're having to work this out on our way. Um, and so he doesn't give an answer. I just want to, because at this point he's sort of waxing off into these great descriptions of the joy that he had upon discovering redemption, but he doesn't answer the question of what the redemption is. Um, let's see. And so I'm happy to begin on the tarantulas at that point, unless you had anything you wanted to add there, Disgraced.
Well, I just would love to. I mean, so he gets to this point where he says he's figured out how to free himself from disgust. Who rejuvenated my eyes? How did I fly to the height where the rabble will no longer sit at the well? But I feel like he must be signaling to us an answer here in some way, right? Like he's kind of saying, "Oh, I have found it, my brothers. Here at the extremest height, the fountain of delight gushes up for me, and here there is a life which no rabble drinks with me." Because remember, he begins by saying that he is disgusted when the rabble drinks with him. You gush up too impetuously, fountains of delight, and wanting to fill the cup, you often empty it again. And I still have to learn to approach you more discreetly. My heart still flows towards you all too impetuously. So is he saying that the way around the rabble is basically to just go to really high heights all the time?
Well, think about what the imagery
Yeah,
of height even represents. This
right.
is this is a difference of human types. Uh, the human type that can rest satisfied among the rabble is simply not going to be the human type uh,
Yeah, right.
that can rise to heights. So what he's really talking about here is the rank order of humans. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
among humans, there are going to be he's in other words, he's still separating the chaff, the wheat from the chaff, because we can't lose sight of the fact that he's had to come back down because uh, his disciples were already not good enough. They've messed his teaching up. They've ended up doing something with the teachings that already existed. Uh, so they've somehow mixed his teachings with the teachings that already exist, and he's had to come back down to get it sorted out. And the best way to sort out uh, this problem he's having is to figure out which disciples are even worth still talking to. Right? Again, nothing is free with Zarathustra and his disciples. So that's that provocation and that rhetoric there, and not necessarily giving us an answer, but just keeping us on sort of on the edge of our seat, is going to be the recurring motif throughout all of book two here.
Well, he spends the rest of this chapter with these. air metaphors. We build our nest in the future. Eagles shall bring us food, food that no unclean men can eat, like up here in their air nest. And then he basically says, we are then going to, one day like wind, I will blow among them, and with my spirit take away the breath from their spirit. And then he always ends with like the best lines. He says, Zarathustra is a strong wind to all flatlands, and he offers this advice to his enemies. And all that spews and spits. Take care not to spit against the wind. So to me, he is giving us an answer. He's just giving us an answer metaphorically. He's basically saying, just, isn't he basically saying, stay atop the perch? Like spend your life atop the perch. Do not, like, the answer is to just climb as high as you can, stay as high as you can. A summer at the extremest height with cold fountains and blissful stillness. Like, find your perch, and then when the time is right, blow down whatever blow down your will upon the rabble, more so than attempting to engage with them. Or am I just projecting? Is that total projection?
Well, I mean, the problem with that is you see in the very deed of what Zarathustra has had to do that you can't stay atop
Right, right,
and
yeah.
free from them, because what's going to happen is that the fact that the herd will always be among man, uh, the herd will always have a tendency to bring everything low, and so the the man that's on high, right? I guess, but again, a better way to think of it is the higher human type, right? The man who has a true understanding of greatness. He's going to have to live. He's going to have to reconcile life among the herd man, right? And now, what that means is going to be explained as we go through the rest of some of these speeches here. But I mean, you are right. In the grand scheme of things, the answer is here in the chapter. It just remains too vague, though, because it just simply says, well, if you're a higher human type, then your enemies are going to fear you, essentially. Um, but let's go ahead and take a look at what he says now in Tarantulas. So again, he's speaking to these same disciples that he's kept them on the edge of their seat with this imagery of redemption, of how they can be redeemed from all this, how they can be redeemed from what the herd man always brings low, right? And the very first thing out of the gate is going to be the most important. Certainly, we're still living with it right now. Uh, and he begins. He says, "Look here, in this hole of the tarantula. Do you want to see the tarantula itself? Its web hangs here. Touch it. Make it tremble. Here it comes, willingly. Welcome, tarantula. On your back, your triangular mark sits in black. And I know, too, what sits in your soul. Revenge sits in your soul. Wherever you bite, there black scabs grow. Your poison makes the soul whirl with revenge. So I speak to you in parables, you who cause the soul to whirl, you preachers of equality. Tarantulas, you are to me and hidden avengers. Okay, so that's a weird translation there, but what he says is the tarantulas, you are preachers of equality. That's the problem. He says, but I want to expose your hiding places to the light. Therefore, I laugh into your face my laughter of heights. Now, um, something to keep in mind about this imagery. He's gone out of his way to say he's going to speak in parables. Uh, just the imagery itself, you know that it's very dangerous. So possibly speaking exactly who they are and what they are could be even more dangerous, even for Zarathustra to his disciples. Uh, and keep in mind this imagery of a web. The imagery of the web is that you're weaving something, right? You're creating something. It's a fiction. Um, and if you poke at it, as he's saying, just poke at the web. That'll bring the person out who's created this, right? And the first thing I think of is poke at the woke, right? Poke at the trans, poke at BLM, and look how all hell gets rained down upon you immediately. And what's so very beautiful about Zarathustra's imagery here is what he's saying is that he's saying, you know what their teaching is, right? It's the web, right? Look, it's the web. Uh, but I'm going to poke at it so that they show what their motivation is behind it. And that's the key thing is to, so you have two combatants on the stage. You've got Zarathustra doing battle with these people, and he's making his motivations perfectly clear. And then you have the weavers of the webs, right? The fictions. And I can't help but think that he also has in mind here the imagery of Penelope from Homer's Odyssey. Because remember, she weaves the web as a big lie. Every night she unweaves it so that she can just keep it going for as absolutely long as possible so she doesn't have to marry one of the suitors. And I think he certainly has that imagery here. Homer is going to come out very shortly here as well. Um, but again, I think what's most important is that if you have two combatants come out onto the stage, what Zarathustra does by poking at their web is he says, effectively, I'm going to show you what their motivation is. It's one thing for you all to know what their teaching is, right? Because you all know what my teaching is. But I want you to know what the motivation behind their teaching is. That's going to be what's crucial. And so his disciples need to know what the motivation is behind the teaching of the people that they have intermixed his teaching with. Because they know his motivation, but he's effectively saying you don't know what their motivation is, and that's why you've erred. That's why you've made this great mistake. Um, and he says, he's continuing. He says, "Therefore, I tear at your web." Okay, so now he's speaking directly to the tarantulas. Therefore, I tear at your web, so that your rage might lure you from your lie hole lair, and your revenge might spring forth from behind your word justice. For, and now here's the key phrase. He says, that mankind be redeemed from revenge. That to me is the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long thunderstorms. So the highest hope of Zarathustra is that man be redeemed from revenge. That's his motivation. He's made it absolutely perfectly clear. What is the motivation of these preachers of equality? Uh, well, I mean, he's already said it, right? Theirs is revenge. And he wants to redeem man from this kind of revenge. Yeah, go ahead.
It's funny that how different our I actually really love my translation, and here you have lie hole, which is like not a phrase, whereas here in mine it's cave of lies. And also you are tarantulas and dealers, and I have you are tarantulas and dealers in hidden revengefulness. So the thing that I think is interesting here is he says, "Therefore I laugh my laughter of the heights in your faces." It's like the last chapter he set up the fact that the solution to the darkness of the rabble was air, light, heights, mountains, or that sort of aesthetic. And then here we're dealing with this climbing monster, right? Like tarantulas, what can oh, what?
So,
What,
sorry,
what?
I have an animus towards that word, and I noticed that Ezra was in here, and so I wanted Ezra to see that I'm an equal opportunity annoyer with the fart button. So please continue.
Which
I'm just messing around. Go ahead.
which word?
I just I don't like that word aesthetic.
Oh, okay.
I'm just messing with you, though. I'm completely messing
No,
with
no, it's fine. It's fine. Uh, anyway, so what word would you prefer to aesthetic?
you. I always choose the word beauty because beauty identifies precisely what we're trying to get at with this thing we call art.
All right, so beauty, like mountain level beauty. Uh, he's got all these this imagery from the last chapter that's that, and he's kind of saying like these climbing animals, these tarantulas are climbing like up the mountain, kind of, or at least they are hiding in these holes full of revengefulness. And he's saying that he's going to pour light and laughter into these holes and reveal them for the sort of vengeful people that they are, which have these warped wills that are, sort of pretend that they're still willpower, but they're these kind of warped, disgusting, malformed wills. And he's going to reveal them for who they really are.
Yeah, and think of it this way. What are these people doing? Well, they're preaching equality. And what does he say that his laughter is that's going to expose them? Well, it's from the heights. And what do the
Yeah,
heights
right,
represent?
yeah.
Heights represent inequality. So the preachers of equality assume that everyone's at the same level. And what he's saying is, look, uh, I'm going to reveal your motivation. I'm going to let everyone in on the truth of your teaching. And I'm doing that precisely from the vantage point that you deny doesn't even exist, which is to say, inequality. I'm better than you people, and I'm going to show you why. And so he's tearing at their web to get them to come out because he wants his disciples to see that what lies behind their activity of the web they've created with this thing that they call justice, he's going to say is revenge, is the resentment, really, is what it's going to come down to. And again, I would just say that for those really curious about this, and this goes back to the differences in the translation there, uh, Nietzsche's going to have some fun with the German here. So that's just sort of something to keep in mind with some synonyms for revenge and whatnot. Um, but but continuing, he says, and so that's the key line, though we can't lose sight of, that mankind be redeemed from revenge. That to me is the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long thunderstorms. And then he says, but the tarantulas, okay, so now he's not talking to the tarantulas anymore. He's talking to his disciples. That's always very, very important when you're reading Nietzsche. Things happen so quickly in Zarathustra. You have to keep in mind, wait a minute, who's he talking to? Is he okay? So there, he was just talking to the tarantulas, but now he's speaking of the tarantulas in the third person. So he has to be talking to his disciples now. Okay, he says, but the tarantulas wanted otherwise, to be sure, that the world become full of the thunderstorm of our revenge, precisely that we would regard as justice. Thus they speak with one another. We want to exact revenge and heap insult on all whose equals we are not. Thus vows the tarantula's heart. Okay, so uh, at the core of the preachers of equality is resentment that they don't have the heights uh, of other people, right? That they're lacking in something that other people have, and they're mad about it. So they want to take revenge. And how do they take revenge? Well, they fabricate, they spin their webs, their lies, simply asserting that everyone is equal. Um, and I think that's just so fucking powerful because look at the world around us right now with this trans stuff, with these the women's sports, all that kind of stuff. Uh, the gynocracy that we live under right now. Everyone is saying that women are just as good as men. You've got Gavin Newsom saying women are better than men. In fact, I think that's what anyone on the left would say right now. Whether they believe it, that's something different. But again, remember, these two chapters, the rabble is dealing with the herd, which is to say, the actual practice of the preachers of equality. And here we're dealing with the theoretical, which is to say, the people who are responsible for coming up with the teaching that got put into practice to create the rabble. And what Zarathustra is teaching is that there is a fundamental resentment at the very core of this teaching. They're angry. They're angry because anyone could possibly exist that is not that they don't equal. Right. In other words, they're angry that there is anyone who could be superior to them in anything. And again, just so absolutely relevant to today. Um, and so continuing, he says, and will to equality, that itself from now on shall be the name for virtue. And against everything that has power, we shall raise our clamor. Okay, so two things. Uh, anything, any kind of inequalities that exist among human types have to be done away with. That's what the tarantulas or the preachers of equality are concerned with. That's one thing. But now he's actually added something even stronger. He says he's attributing to these tarantulas, these theoreticians. This really, I think what he has in mind here is academia. This is fundamentally about academia. What he's saying is that anyone who has power. So it's not just if people are in unequal, right? It's the fact that anyone could have power. They want to take it all. They want everything. Um, so they're going at. I mean, this is truly within the realm of uh, political revolution. I mean, absolutely in the realm of political revolution. One could even say political apocalypse. Um, and he says, "You preachers of equality, the tyrant's madness of impotence cries thus out of you for equality. Your secret tyrant's cravings mask themselves thus in your words of virtue. Aggrieved conceit, repressed envy, perhaps the conceit and envy of your fathers. It erupts from you like a flame and the madness of revenge." Okay, so now he's giving us a genealogy. So what we have here is thorough political revolution, uh, deep rooted resentment at the fact that there are people who could be better than others. That's one thing. Anyone who even has any power whatsoever, they have to be brought down. That's another thing. And now he's saying, uh, maybe it's from your fathers, right? In other words, your predecessors. Now, what could possibly be the predecessors of preachers of equality? Well, two stand out immediately. On the one hand, you have Christianity. On the other hand, you have the Greeks. The Greeks are the ones who give us this a kind of understanding of democracy, and Christianity levels the playing field with. I mean, there's a number of ways one could approach this, but the way I would approach it is by conscience. Right. This is what Augustine gives us, uh, and what conscience reveals is natural law. So every human being, no matter how incompetent, they still have access to the minimum of divine law to know what's right and wrong. Um, but, and this is the key, Nietzsche is under what Nietzsche is saying. Well, I'm sorry, this isn't Nietzsche again. I think we can say it is Nietzsche, but it's his Zarathustra. What his Zarathustra is teaching is that there are ancient roots to this modern teaching. The modern teaching is the sons. That's who he's talking to. The people of today, they're the sons. Who are their fathers? Well, this is going back into the history, the prehistory of the preachers of equality. Comes from, on the one hand, Greek, uh, and I guess we could throw in Roman sources there as well, but really Greek. And then on the other hand, Christianity. Now, what is the historical irony here to this, which is really quite beautiful, and Nietzsche certainly aware, or Zarathustra certainly aware of it, is, and because he's going to say so here in a minute, is that neither the Greeks nor the Christians prior to modernity preached equality, right? And so that's just absolutely beautiful. So he's so what he's it's an at least twofold attack on these modern preachers of equality, because they're aliens to their own fathers. They don't realize the fact that there was no preaching of a political equality among the Christians prior to modernity. There was no preaching of equality among democracy in classical Athens. In fact, they had slaves. And we just found out, by the way, that the most difficult thought for Zarathustra to come to terms with is the fact that you can't have masters unless you also have slaves. The herd has to exist. So all of these things are coming together now. Um, and he says he's going to go farther now into this genealogy, literally a genealogy of these preachers of equality. He's going to say, "What is silent in the Father learns to speak in the Son, and often I found the Son to be the Father's exposed secret." Uh, okay, that's going to complicate things because now he's. This is where again you'll find a rift between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. What what Zarathustra has just said is that this teaching was in fact secret even within the original. Now that's where someone might take issue with Zarathustra, because now we're getting into the very deep realms of theory, right? This is genuine philosophy taking place right here, and Zarathustra keeps his cards very close to his chest on his sources for these things. But we'll just go with him, okay? Just to hear him out. Um, he says they resemble the inspired. Now, we have to keep in mind who's the they right there. Is it the fathers or the sons? But we'll continue. He says they resemble the inspired, but it is not the heart that inspires them, but revenge. So we see we're coming back again to this role of revenge and resentment. And when they are refined and cold, it is not the spirit, but envy that makes them refined and cold. Okay, again, full stop. This is so crucial to understanding the psychological teaching that Nietzsche has in mind here. Um, this gets to something that I'm doing in my own Nietzsche spaces when it comes to this role of how we communicate with others. Um, we think, for instance, that being able to stay calm and not get triggered is a good thing, right? Because very often you dunk on people. We see people getting dunked on the timeline because they lost their shit, right? They chimped or whatever, and then people think they're like, "I win, I got under your skin." But think very carefully about what Zarathustra is saying here. It's only when that inner hatred or that inner anger or resentment at a kind of inequality gets refined enough that it becomes hidden, right? So if you can't speak your mind to people, if you master the art of refined speaking, in other words, refined dunking on people that everyone else values, right, that they think is so great, does that bring you closer to the overman or to the last man? I think it's pretty clear that what Nietzsche's saying right here, what Zarathustra is saying right here, is that that brings you closer to the last man, because real men speak their mind. Because what happens to resentment is that if you let it gestate, right, if you let it seed inside of you, you find ways to refine it so that you can still express it, but you're expressing it now just in acceptable ways. Yeah, go ahead, describe.
Yeah, I love this. And I think this really gets to a core of one of Nietzsche's aesthetic, no, aesthetic strengths, which is, his strengths as a, you see it so fundamentally when you read BAP. And you see it in so many people of our generation, not being afraid to write in this disgusting gynocratic managioisie email language that's all, you know, fake exclamation points and this cold, it's
and
this
and the
like
pronouns
coldness.
and the
Yeah,
pronouns, right?
right.
Because even the people who don't themselves take on this gender nonsense, they'll still have in their bios the pronouns, right? Because, oh well, it's not hurting anyone. Well, yeah, really it is. But yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Right. No, I just think you can see when I read a Nietzschean's writing, I can feel the heat and the fire that is like burning within that person. And I think that when you read the cold, sort of ironic writing of our opponents, they're the descendant of this. I mean, I guess we would call it Christian way of, if you keep yourself refined and short spoken and you know um that shows that you're smart, and that shows that you're compassionate and all these things. We're like afraid to yell and shout, and so much of our society presses down on this masculine urge to like be loud. To be like, everybody always gives me so much shit in my new office building because there's thin walls and I have an office that's just my own office. And everybody's like, dude, you're so loud. Like, shut the fuck up. And we're supposed to have this horrible embarrassment of being cringe if we're too loud and too masculine and like shouting as men. Whereas what Nietzsche's saying is that coldness that you're supposed to have, that cringing at yourself, actually comes from resentment and envy. And I think that that is just, when you look at the nature of the way that people speak in our scene, what I love about us so much is that we all use exclamation points, but not in the ironic way. We like mean it. We mean it when we use exclamation points. And I think that this is such a core point of that. I'm really trying to not say the A word, but there's got to be some better word for, like talking about the character of a type of art. I don't know, but anyway, you
Yeah,
get me.
let me rephrase this a little bit, because I think this is such an important point that's happened here. And oh, I'm glad Chase is in here too, because I'm drawing out the parallels, or I'm drawing out Nietzsche's presentation of the difference between modern Christianity and ancient Christianity, because that's extremely, extremely important. Because again, it's very often lost on people that Nietzsche has the greatest respect for Christ, but it's the tradition of Christianity that he has a problem with. And here in this chapter on the tarantulas, with the preachers of equality, it's all coming together. And what he's just said is, he said, let me make sure I find this. He's okay. He said they resemble the inspired. He's talking about, what he's saying is that he's saying that the preachers of equality today, he's just said that it's probably, they're just the sons of previous fathers. And who are those fathers? Well, on the one hand, you've got the Greeks with the democracy, and then on the other hand, you've got Christianity with the role of conscience that places even the most, I guess we could say, like low IQ or something, person in direct contact with God. And what Nietzsche said is, he says they resemble the inspired, but it's not the heart that inspires them, but revenge. And when they are refined and cold, it's not the spirit, but envy that makes them refined and cold. And what I'm emphasizing here is that that's in many respects the key phrase, because when you let resentment or anger or something sit inside of you, and you master the ways to express it in other ways, which is to say, you become a good debater, or you get good at not losing your temper. Um, I think that places one closer to the last man than the overman, because uh, you're doing something which everyone knows is supposed to be not acceptable, but you're doing it in an acceptable way. And also, so that's the refined part. You just simply refine it. But that emphasis there on the cold, we can't lose sight of the fact that what Zarathustra has already said very earlier, is that the state is the coldest of all colds. So the manifestation of the last man itself, the most powerful manifestation of it, are the current institutions. And what he's just said about one's refinement to the sign of the times, whether it's this newfound iteration of Christianity or this newfound iteration of the Greeks, it's closer to the last man than it is to the overman. Yeah, Uber Boyle, go ahead. Speak up, man. And I didn't get a single laugh from doing my horrible Scottish accent. Disgrace, can you hear me? Am I losing signal here a
No, no,
bit?
I got you. I got you. I
Okay,
thought that was
okay.
him raising his hand, but I don't know if he's.
He might
Uh,
have stepped away. He might
yeah.
have stepped away, but he
Oh,
could if he can. Ah, there he
I heard
goes.
you from the
There he
other end of
goes.
the room, but I didn't know. I didn't actually know what was going on there for a second.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I thought it was him.
Okay, my bad, my bad. Well, look, I was going to pop in on this because I absolutely love this section. Of course, I even made a little animation on this before, and this specific part is really, really psychologically interesting. Precisely as the way you're describing it, Athenian. You kind of took the words out of my mouth a bit, but like, what is Nietzsche always banging on about masters and slaves? And this is related to how people can express their passions in some sense. We're all given this quantum of passion in our lives. And the winner usually gets to express their passions. You know, he can make love with the girl, he can get what he wants, he can release his energy. That's the sort of virtue of, or the blessing on the winner. And the loser can't. You know, the loser gets cucked, he gets castrated, he can't express his passions, he can't let the energy out of him. And for this reason, the energy doesn't leave, of course, it just stays inside of him. And it starts to distort and twist. And Nietzsche would always say, like, even in this phrase, it gets like stuck inside of you and then it festers into vengeance. You know, it begins as envy and then it festers into vengeance. And he always says something very interesting about the psychology of the loser or the slave, in that they become better thinkers, they become more crafty, they become more intelligent. In some sense, they're more powerful than the masters because their ability to outthink them, to outwit them, the way the priest can manipulate the mind and he becomes more skilled at thinking this way. And the masters, the maybe more warrior types, tend to be a little bit naive. This is often their problem. They tend to be a little bit forgetful because forgetful is happiness and joy and even power in some sense. And so this specific phrase where he's saying, you though you may be subtle, it is not your spirit that's doing it. It's not like you're a kind of a crafty master warrior who's like planning like Napoleon how to win a battle, but you're definitely crafty in your own way. You've suppressed you haven't been able to express, or you've suppressed your natural passions, your natural instincts, and you've kind of sat there in the corner and tried to get in your head and think about a way that you can get vengeance in the world, or a way that you can spin things to your advantage and stuff like this. And I always find this a really, really interesting psychological sort of take on the resentful person, precisely as you yourself and Athenian are saying, these characters in the academies and all this, trying to bend the world towards their will. So it's a really, really brilliant phrase.
Yeah, and one thing I want to be sure to add here is that um, it's also very important to understand, and this is where we have a crossover between Plato and Nietzsche. Is we can never forget that what Socrates says in the Republic is that the city is the greatest of all sophists, and that's why uh, we end up having philosophers who disgrace philosophy, right? Because you're always going to have sycophants. You're always going to have people that recognize good talent and they're going to lead them astray. And so that's something to be very wary of for Nietzsche's disciples, Zarathustra's disciples, because what he's saying is that if you yourself, because very often they have the best talent, right? And what he's saying is if you yourself allow yourself, well, Department of Redundancy Department, if you allow yourself to become good at their ways, you bring yourself down. So you could very well have someone who's incredibly talented and is a disciple of Zarathustra, but he flirts with the preachers of equality just enough to fuck things up because what he's and I'll just continue reading here for a second. Um, I'm going to skip over some parts. Well, I'm going to jump down a little bit uh, because I don't want this space to go too long. But uh, he says, he says, but thus I counsel you, my friends, mistrust all in whom the drive to punish is strong. Those are people of bad kind and kin. In their faces, the hangman and the bloodhound are visible. Mistrust all those who speak much of their justice. Indeed, their souls are lacking not only honey. And when they call themselves the good and the just, uh, that, by the way, is the phrase that the last man has become. The last man was used pretty much just in the last man's speech. And then he immediately, when he was off on his own, redefined it in terms of the good and the just, because that's what The jester snuck up behind him and let him know that it's the good and the just. So he's saying, and when they call themselves, in other words, the they is the last men. When the last men call themselves the good and the just, then do not forget that all they lack to be Pharisees is power. And then he says, "My friends, I do not want to be mixed in with and mistaken for others." Now, let's pause there for a second. He says, "Mistrust all in whom the drive to punish is strong." And he's actually about, if he didn't already just say, mistrust all those who speak very much about their justice. He's just spent 2 sections talking about justice. So Zarathustra, again, is offering this very subtle way in which he's wanting his disciples to still mistrust him in a way. Because remember, what he said from the very, very beginning is he wants people that are going to reach for his crown. So he wants to sow seeds. He has to find a way to separate the belief among his disciples that there's any reconciliation between his teaching and that of the last man. But he also wants to make sure that in doing so, he doesn't create zealous fanatics, right? He wants people that are still going to have enough uh, tension, we could say, chaos in their souls, to even cast doubt upon the master, right? That's one of the things he says in this about the speech of the overman. Is he says, I want disciples. Well, he says this when he's alone. He says, I want disciples who will one thing, the overman, but I want them to will what I want it to be, right? That's when you get down to the brass tacks of things and say, man, fuck, is this going to be humanly possible? Can you have a founder, because that's what he is. He's a founder of new modes and orders, as Machiavelli would say. This is book 6 of Machiavelli's Prince. Machiavelli says, by far the hardest thing for anyone is to be a founder of new modes and orders. And Zarathustra absolutely is a new founder. And the difficulty in Zarathustra's teaching is that he wants his disciples, the people that are going to be Zarathustrians, I guess we could say, he wants them to still have enough independence of thought so that they're not these carbon copies of him, because he realizes the difficulties in idolatry or what have you. But at the same time, he still wants them to will his goal, right? And how is that possible? Is it possible to ever found a school of thought that doesn't, at some point along the way, fundamentally deviate from the founder? Um, in many respects, that's the question of political philosophy. In other words, how do you transmit the political project? How do you ensure that it doesn't get uh, contaminated going on down the realm? And then here's the key line. He says, "My friends, I do not want to be mixed in with and mistaken for others." Uh, he says, "There are those who preach my doctrine of life, and at the same time, they are preachers of equality and tarantulas." And he's going to, and in case we blink, right, in case we blink like last men, he's going to repeat that. He says, they speak in favor of life, these poisonous spiders, even though they are sitting in their holes and have turned against life because they want to do harm. Okay, so we pause. There's a number of things going on there. The first thing that pops into my mind is twofold, because again, I think fundamentally what he has in mind here in this very theoretical section are the academics, but there's simply no way around it. He is also talking about the modern church. And so the first thing I think of when he says they speak in favor of life, and they speak in favor of my understanding of life, but also they're preachers of equality. That's the trans flags in the churches. That's what's going on there. And that's really just a repetition of something that originally happened, as I said at the beginning of the space, when Nietzsche first came to America and to Britain. Uh, of course, it was the very liberal theological schools and the academics who were always of the left, and they wanted to have their Nietzsche, but they still wanted to have their leftism at the same time. And I see this today among various there's a number of ways this pops up in the literature. There are people who will and have written entire books, entire commentaries, that Nietzsche can be reconciled with Christianity. That's not possible. I'm just here to tell you that right now. Nietzsche and Christianity cannot be reconciled. Um, and then at the same time, you're going to have academics who just love Nietzsche, but they're still of the left. And so they're still fundamentally of this kind of preachers of equality. And that goes back to the imagery used in the last section on the rabble, is that there fundamentally is differences between human types. And that's what that's the image that Zarathustra uses to expose the tarantulas. As he says, "I'm going to use my laughter from the heights to expose you people who want to say that we're all fundamentally equal, because no, we're not." Yeah, go ahead, Desiree.
Yeah, this is such an important part here because he's struggling with several things here. But the really interesting thing is, again, this line that you just read. I think that he says twice, which is, "There are those who preach my doctrine of life, yet they are at the same time preachers of equality and tarantulas. They speak well of life, these poison spiders, although they sit in their caves with their backs turned on life. This is because they want to do harm by speaking well of life. They want to do harm to those who now possess power. For with those, the preaching of death is still most at home." So what he's saying here, I think the example you use of the trans flags in the churches is a good one. The one that I would use as a branding and propaganda guy, the best example of this is Black Rifle Coffee Company. It's like Black Rifle Coffee Company wants to destroy it wants to pretend that it is a preacher of life because it wants power, because it's at odds with global homogeneity, right? It knows that there's a push and a desire in the world to be pro-life, but all that it really wants, all Black Rifle Coffee Company wants, really is just to be another preacher of equality, right? Like deep down, it is a preacher of equality. It's just using the voice of a Nietzschean in order to achieve that resentment and that victory and that taking of power from the other preachers of equality, right? So, like, I think that that's what he's saying here, is that it's like it's this weaponized, like there's a certain kind of creature that weaponizes the genuine love of life and the genuine preaching of life, but only because they want to use that language in order to place themselves in a position of power.
Yeah, before I respond to that, yeah, go ahead, Uber Boyle, please.
Nothing much to add to this, but just a simple observation I've always made with this is that it's basically the way Nietzsche gets really misrepresented. You know, you'd go into Reddit and they'll be saying that Nietzsche was an individualist and he was trying to get you to bring your will to power to tell your dad that you don't like him and stuff like this and to rebel against him and all this. And it's, you know, it's the kind of distortion of a very basic idea that he's trying to tell you. Maybe Nietzsche's saying you should be an individualist because you're perhaps excellent, but people obviously skip out on the excellent part. So we often see this distortion happening.
Right. How, like, a Reddit Fedora atheist is going to have a boner when Nietzsche says God is dead and be completely missing the point.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm
precisely.
trying not to laugh. I'm trying not to laugh because one of the things I love the most about anonymous Twitter is the way in which some people have fully mastered the use of creating their names. I saw that my space got retweeted by 70s cocaine dealer, which I just love that because anyway, um, yeah. One of the things I would add here is he's about to say something very important, because remember, I pointed out that when he says what he sees is possibly the fathers speaking through the sons, which is to say the sons are the preachers of equality. Um, he's about to point out that their own fathers are alien to them. This is where he's going to return to that genealogy of two things. On the one hand, the Greeks, and on the other hand, Christianity. And what he's about to say is that the modern Christians preaching equality don't even know their own fathers. And this is what he says. he says they want to harm those who hold power today, for among them the sermon of death is still most at home. If it were otherwise, then the tarantulas would teach otherwise. And they, after all, were formerly the best world slanderers and burners of heretics. So there you have it. That's going to be a very, very powerful comment that Zarathustra gives about modern Christianity versus pre modern Christianity. So Nietzsche certainly recognizes that there has been a radical shift in Christianity in modern times precisely because of this new thing under the sun, this new Enlightenment ideal, this modern ideal of equality. That has fundamentally altered uh, the Christian position on things. So much has it altered the position that the Christian sons don't even recognize what their fathers used to be, right? Uh, Now, of course, he's gone further already uh, by saying that, possibly the seed was there in the father already. So that's going to be the difference between Nietzsche and a Dostoevsky. Because what Nietzsche is going to say is he's saying, look, even though the sons are alien to their fathers, this, in some respects, is the logical conclusion from the fathers, which is to say that this genealogy that he's giving us of the syncretism that comes out with the corruption of modern Christianity is that it was there all the time. And I want to be very, very clear when I say this. That is where Nietzsche is keeping his cards very close to his chest. We're very, very deep in the weeds of genuine philosophy here. And Zarathustra is not telling us why he makes that claim. And because there are very good arguments that that is in fact not the case. Um, I would simply point to some of my very, very close friends here who are very pious Christians, and they absolutely hate all of this stuff. They would have no problem whatsoever still performing another crusade on all of this ideology, this woke stuff, everything that we're dealing with today, and they don't acknowledge equality whatsoever, and they're very, very thoughtful people. So I want to be absolutely clear that I'm not espousing this. I'm showing you in deep detail how it is that Zarathustra brings it up and addresses it. And I want to emphasize here as well. I need to double check the German here, but I think this is at least probably correct. He says he says he says what is silent in the Father learns to speak in the Son, and often I found the Son to be the Father's exposed secret. That very, very subtle word, often. That's not a claim of necessity. So even Nietzsche with Zarathustra is being very, very subtle in saying it might not always be the case that Christianity results in this last man. What he is in fact saying, though, is he's saying that very often. So there's something incredibly powerful about this preachers of equality, which again, we don't even have to call it the preaching of equality anymore. Let's just call it for what Zarathustra has identified it as. He said what it really is the motives of revenge, resentment. It's anger at the fact that other people who are better than you exist. And so that's the whole motive behind this claim of egalitarianism, is that there are just a shit ton of people who are ass hurt that other people are better than them. Um, and so then Zarathustra is really going to come out and say, he's just going to make no bones about it. He says, he says, I do not want to be mixed in with and mistaken for these preachers of equality, for thus justice speaks to me. Humans are not equal. Okay, there you have it. I mean, it doesn't get any more clear than that. Uh, Life for Zarathustra, life for Nietzsche, is fundamentally a, a realm of inequality. There simply are, as a matter of obvious fact, better humans than ourselves, and also at the same time worse humans than ourselves, right? Remember that was the key teaching of the rabble, right? The consequence of this theoretical teaching in this chapter, the practical consequence of it with the rabble in the previous chapter, is that he found out that you can't have masters without slaves. So that's going to be built into, in a very, very difficult way, his teaching of the eternal return of the same, is that you can't will that you eliminate the herd altogether. They're simply always going to be there. They're parts. The herd and the last man are simply parts. And in many respects, the most important part, precisely because the most difficult part, that you have to look back and say, was that life? Well, okay, then once more. So that's going to be something, right? He's not talking about. He's not a preacher of genocide, but we have to also keep in mind he does say that what he wants in his disciples are annihilators. So it could very well be the case, and I'm rather persuaded, I think that it is, that you are going to have at least one generation of annihilators that just, they've got them. Look, the teaching of justice to Zarathustra is that humans are not equal. And we are in the situation where, politically speaking, the worst are the ones who are in charge of everything. So how do you reconcile that, right? How does that get resolved? Well, if it's going to be a political teaching, which I argue that Nietzsche's Zarathustra, he's a founder. It's in many respects, it's the political teaching, because Nietzsche argues for a globalized version of this, not just on a state level or a local level, certainly not on the silly individual level of self improvement. No, this is global, baby. We're taking this thing as large as it can go. Um, and so he says, justice speaks to me. Humans are not equal. And then he immediately says, and with an exclamation point, and they shouldn't become so either. He says, what would my love for the overman be if I spoke otherwise? He's really shaming his disciples at this point. How can you possibly mix my fundamental teaching of the overman with equality? It's impossible. You're trying to fit a square into a circle hole. It's not going to work. Not even close, not even an inch, not even a millimeter, nothing. It does not work. And let's see. Shit, we're coming up on 2 hours now. Let me just wrap this up. So I'm going to have to skip over a few things in here. There's some really, some of these one-liners you can spend entire spaces on.
I've got a quick question. What
Yeah,
what
go
do
for it.
you think of, if we're, for justice speaks thus to me, men are not equal. So I mean, he's clearly, I'm sure that has to be a reference to the Declaration of Independence, right? Or at some level, he's got to be thinking of Enlightenment people. He has to be uh, responding to them in a way. Do you think that that's true?
Yeah, but far more in a large way than just America. Now he does have some interesting comments. He does have some interesting comments about America. I'll have to dig those up. It's really quite funny. He gives praise to America, but not in the way that America would want to be praised, because he basically is saying they've taken it further, uh, as far as accelerationism towards the last man.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, this is going. You have to keep in mind what was happening in the 19th century, in Germany, but all over Europe at the time, and slowly happening in America, was socialism. Nietzsche reserves by far, and it's not even close, his greatest criticism for socialists. He hates socialists so much more than anybody else because they are the last man. They've already made it to last man status. Uh, they there's no redeeming them. They're just they're the worst. Hates them the most. So there's that. So he has that far more in mind than like the Declaration of Independence or anything like that. But let me see here. He says, okay. He says, good and evil and rich and poor and high and trifling and all the names of values, they shall be weapons and clanging signs that life must overcome itself again and again. Now that's important because he's making it perfectly clear that this is not something that's a one-shot thing, right? So it's not so much that there's any kind of cycles that are going to happen with Nietzsche. It's just that he recognizes the fundamental fleeting nature of human existence itself. Uh, all things, all things have their greatness, and then they all find their demise. But he says, uh, let's see, he says life. He says life itself wants to build itself into the heights with pillars and steps. It wants to gaze into vast distances and out upon halcyon beauties. Therefore, it needs heights. Okay, what he's saying there, again, to repeat, he's just driving the point home, is that there are fundamental differences among human types. Inequality. Inequality is not something that uh, can be overcome in every case. There are just some people who are better and some people who are worse. Period. I mean, they might be able to take their various potentials or excellencies as far as they can, uh, but it's not going to surpass other kinds of human types. I mean, there's just fundamental differences in the very beings of humans. Um, and he says, and because it needs height, it needs steps and contradiction between steps and climbers. Life wants to climb and overcome itself by climbing. And he says, and this is if you blink, you'll miss this. This is one of the most beautiful lines in all of Nietzsche, and it speaks directly to that genealogy of the sons and the fathers, which is to say the genealogy of both the tradition of the Greeks and the tradition of Christianity that Nietzsche recognizes. He says, and look here, my friends, here, where the tarantula hole is. The ruins of an ancient temple are rising. Look here now with enlightened eyes. Okay, uh, what is this ancient temple? Right? In other words, he's pointing at it because it's coming from out of the hole of the tarantula. Uh, is he referring to the genealogy of what has led to the tarantula, or is he referring to what can become of the tarantula? In other words, is there a resurgence of the Greeks or ancient Christianity? Is that one possibility, or is it the case that from the tarantulas, even as they come out of their hole, you can still see little indicators of their history? Um, so we hang a little question mark over there because that ancient temple that's rising is that's we have to ask ourselves: does Zarathustra encourage that temple to keep rising, or is it something he's pointing at to say beware of? Um, he says indeed, because he's about to give us the answer. He says, indeed, the one who once heaped his thoughts skyward here in stone, he knew the secret of all life like the most wise. That struggle and inequality and war for power and supremacy are found even in beauty. He teaches us that here in the clearest parable. Now, the parable, of course, is the tarantula, the story of the tarantula. Now, this is where there's a very fortuitous event in life. Uh, Disgrace and I had planned this space for a while. And this morning, when I opened up the app, uh, I saw that one of my great mutuals, Doug, was hosting. They finished their speeches. They finished their spaces on Bronze Age mindset. It took them a year because they went nice and slow, the way that you're supposed to. And then they were looking for more stuff to read, and what they read was Homer's Contest. Uh, what the words that Nietzsche is using right here, they're almost word for word for some lines he uses in that very text of Homer's Contest. So what he has in mind here is Homer. And this teaching of Homer it's said, and I have the citations if anyone wants to message me for them. But it's said about Achilles that he's always taught to be the best and strive to be the best at all things, right? Always be the best. And that's the fundamental description of the agon for Nietzsche. That's what he's challenging his own disciples here with, right? When he's telling them, be wary of people that talk a lot about justice and punishment. Uh, well, excuse me, Zarathustra, you've just spent 2 sections talking about justice and punishment. So are we supposed to be wary of you? And of course, the answer is yes. Because if you're not wary of Zarathustra, you end up becoming precisely what he does not want. There's 2 things Zarathustra doesn't want fundamentally. On the one hand, he doesn't want last men, and on the other hand, he doesn't want sock puppet disciples. He doesn't want people that just walk around quoting him. Nietzsche says this. Nietzsche says that. Nietzsche was right when he said this. Look, that's not what he wants. That's absolutely not what he wants. He wants people who are going to challenge him, um, and challenge him in a way that I mentioned previously that speaks to the difficulty of all founders. How do you have people that still have enough tension or chaos in them to challenge the founder while at the same time still only seeking the same goal that the founder wanted? Um, but we can leave that here for a second, and because now he's going to say something very important, very revealing, and then I'll just wrap it up, and we'll throw it out there for questions or what have you. He says, let's see, he says, oh, I found a difficulty in the Greek or in the German here too as well. He says, how divinely the vault um, and the arch bend and break each other as they wrestle, how they struggle against each other with light and shadow, these divinely struggling ones. He says, in this manner, uh, securely and beautifully, let us also be enemies. My friends, uh, let us struggle against each other like the gods. This translation that I have is very sloppy in that what it says is, and this is the Cambridge edition, he says, in this manner, sure and beautiful, let us also be enemies, my friends. Divinely, let us struggle against each other. That's not what's said in the German. In the German, he says, struggle against each other like gods. I think I have to double check, but I'm pretty sure. Because that really brings the point home that he's emphasizing once again that we are in the realm of radical atheism with Nietzsche. There's no doubt about it. He has a number of lines to that effect. Zarathustra does. One of the most important being, how could I even live if there could be not gods or something? Because I myself am a god. But okay. But he says, alas, then the tarantula bit me, my old enemy, divinely sure and beautiful. It bit me on the finger. Punishment and justice must be, thus he thinks. Not for nothing shall he sing his song in honor of hostility here. So Zarathustra speaking for the tarantula there. And then he says, yes, it has avenged itself. And alas, now it will also make my soul whirl with revenge. But so that I do not whirl, my friends, bind me fast to this pillar here. I would rather be a stylite. This translation is really going off the rails. I'd rather be a stylite than a whirlwind of revenge. Indeed, Zarathustra is no tornado or whirlwind, and if he is a dancer, never more a tarantula dancer. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Okay, so a number of things have happened there, and I'll just address a few of them. One of the most important things that happened is Zarathustra has invoked that very famous scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus was told how to get to the underworld by Kirke. And Kirke says, but make sure your men, if you have to listen to the sirens, if you have to listen to them, just make sure that your men bind you to the mast, because otherwise, they're going to seduce you onto their island. You're going to crash. Everyone dies. And the way they seduce is through knowledge, right? They sing this great depth of knowledge that everyone wants to know, and it seduces them. Uh, but but for Zarathustra, the imagery is reversed, right? The tarantula already bit him, and then he gets tied to the mast. So that's very, very important to keep in mind. So there's been another case where Zarathustra was bitten uh, by something that had poison. That was the otter's bite. And there too, in book one, Zarathustra was talking about the kind of justice he has in mind with regard to Christianity and the love of neighbor, honor thy neighbor. But here he's speaking on a much larger scale. Um, and in this time he's been infected by the tarantula. The otter actually crawls back up to his neck and says, "Sorry, friend. Here, I'll suck it right back out and go away." The tarantula does not. So you have to ask yourself, how is this poison going to infect Zarathustra? And what is the poison? Let's be perfectly clear. It's not the preaching of equality. It's a kind of revenge. It's wanting to get revenge. So is that going to affect him? And then, of course, he says Zarathustra is a dancer, but he doesn't do the tarantula dance. Now, the thing about the tarantula dance is it was considered to be a cure for having been bitten by the tarantula, and you imitate the effects of the tarantula.
Yeah, it's the
Uh,
Tarantella.
right, exactly.
Yeah, and in my translation, it's such a better line in my translation. He says, and although he is a dancer, he is by no means a tarantella dancer, which is just actually a very cute like pun that he's making at the very end. And I think what he's trying to say here, it's a beautiful thing because he's saying, look, I'm battling infinitely with this tarantula. It's all goes back to this question that I actually asked at the beginning, which is, once we're past good and evil, how then, if everything, as you said, is there's nothing that goes all the way down to the roots that's stable. It's always changing. Everything's in flux all the time. How can we take our hatred of tarantulas all the way to the core, all the way to the base? And he's struggling with that, right? He's saying, look, I'm going to be in battle with you tarantulas forever. And there's something beautiful to that anyway, right? He's saying that we're dancing, blah, blah, blah. But the thing that I am not going to do is I'm never going to become like you, tarantula. I'm never going to bite people out of envy, out of resentment, and out of resentment that person is able to achieve more and everything like that. He says, "Come at me, let's fight, let's battle. I want my disciples to be, challenging me, and I'm never gonna bite them back, and I'm not even gonna bite the tarantula back when it bites me. I'm never gonna resent it. I'm never gonna go down to its level." I feel like is what he's saying here.
Well, I'm going to have to inject a little bit of moderation there because it's not so clear to me that he's saying that he's immune to the tarantula because we don't know. He's been bitten, right? There's something about dealing with preachers of equality uh, because I think when you get to Nietzsche's teaching on the psychology at its fundamental core, being guided by always resentment is the engine that moves the psychology of man. Uh, it guides will to power for Nietzsche. That's always the most important thing. And we don't know precisely if there's a kind of revenge or resentment going on with Zarathustra because remember, he's horrified when the at the beginning of part two when his disciples show him his teaching. He's like, "Oh God, that's not me. I have to go fix this." Um, and now there's a number of things going on there because uh, just like he told us in the last chapter on the rabble, the very sight of the herd or the rabble, right? These two things, the very existence of them is the hardest in the world for him to choke down. And I have to emphasize again, for eternal return of the same to work, it's going to have to will the most difficult of all things to will, which Zarathustra has just been clear about is the herd, or as we would say, no masters without slaves. And oh, and someone, by the way, someone did comment on the space a good question of the fact of, does the herd have to be the slave? That's a really good question, because keep in mind, and someone said something about upward mobility or something. Uh, I I'm weary of that language, because even the language of upward mobility smacks more of last man than overman. But what I would say is this: remember what Zarathustra has taught from day one is that being itself is fundamentally becoming. It's always in flux. So these things that we call master, slave, uh, they can they can change, right? In fact, they have to change in order for that transvaluation of all values to even be able to take place. So if there is any kind of cycle to history or something like that, it's going to hinge on the fact that human nature itself, whatever it is so plastic that it can, in fact, change to something that's greater than it was. But at the same time, right, it's a crapshoot. It can also change into something worse than it was. Masters do, in fact, become slaves, while slaves do, in fact, become masters. But he
Well,
does say, though, he does say,
but if that's
go ahead.
true, Athenian, if that's true, then how can he say that people aren't equal? I think that's what he's struggling with here, because anybody can become a master given the right opportunity.
Well, hold on.
Then,
It's not anybody. It's not anybody, because remember what he says. He says life itself requires these heights, right? He said it needs steps and contradictions. So there are human types that are just inferior, and there are human types that are superior. Now, the ability of those to get better or get worse, that of course is going to be rather plastic. Um, but you're right. There does seem to be a kind of there's a possible contradiction there, right? Because if everything is fundamentally fluid, then even this language of human types would be fluid. Um, that's something that is very much worth us hanging a question mark over, because I'm trying to recall a line in the genealogy morality where he addresses this. Um, I have to go back and find it. But at least in this section, in Zarathustra, in this section, he's certainly making the case that there has to be different kinds of human types. But again, Zarathustra is also learning, right? Zarathustra has made mistakes. He's made enormous mistakes, and he's going to be correcting these things along the way. Uh, and so again, this is where we always have to keep in mind the very ending as opposed to the very beginning, right? So from the beginning, his teaching was that, yes, there are these human types. Uh, will he come to the very end with the same confidence that there are fundamental human types? That would be the way that I would go about answering that one, because you are exactly right. I mean that's a big kink in the flaw, or a big kink in the machine. Uh, so yeah, and also he says, Zarathustra says that he's not going to do the tarantella dance, right? So he might he dances, yes, and while it is true that the tarantula dance is in fact a dance, that's not one that he's going to engage in. So something about the preachers of equality he will not abide. Something about their resentment he won't abide. But still, it does, I think, leave open the question of is there well, let me rephrase it. To what extent does Zarathustra's disgust at the existence of the last man, to what extent does that influence his teaching going forward, right? Because he says he almost choked on it, so we can expect some bumps along the way. Yeah, go ahead.
oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that you're exactly, yeah, I think that he's really struggling between these two things here, and he's admitting when he gets bitten by the tarantula, he's saying, yes, the tarantula has revenged itself against him. And alas, now it will make my soul too giddy with revenge. But so I may not veer round, tie me tight to this pillar, my friends. I would rather be a pillar saint, that's what it has in my translation versus what it had in yours, than a whirlpool of revengefulness. So he's saying, I'm bitten. I have the tarantula nature revenge in me to get back at you now, but I would rather be tied to the mast, like in the Odyssey, than to succumb to that, uh, what he calls, to succumb basically to that desire to get tarantula-like revenge. And
Yeah.
maybe what he, yeah, sorry, maybe what, no, yeah, that's it.
No, I was just going to say, if your translation has the word revenge in there with the tornado or the whirlwind, I'll have to check on that because that's significant.
Yeah, it says it does. It does have revenge in there. Yeah.
Yeah, because mine doesn't. And so this is where we end up with possible problems, because it's one thing to say that he's not a tornado or a whirlwind. It's something else entirely to say that he's not going to have that of revenge. So I'll check the German on that, because that's going to be key.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's sort of the thing here. Um, so and this is where we can sort of leave it, I guess, at a cliffhanger or something, because again, I just want to emphasize, so many things happened in this chapter, and this by far is the most important chapter for political philosophy students in all of Zarathustra, because he's just told us the extent to which his teaching has to be political, precisely because his opponents are so fundamentally political. And they want to take away not just the differences among humans, human types, but he specifically said there they want to take away power from anybody. And again, this is so absolutely relevant to the discussions that we're seeing that are forced down our throats today with, like, the trans and the BLM. That is absolutely what they are wanting, is all in the name of equality. These people are preachers of radical equality. It's almost hard to put into words how prescient this is. Um, and Zarathustra has pointed out that he wants absolutely nothing to do with their teachings. You cannot reconcile Zarathustra with preachers of equality. And more importantly, he says that it's not just that they're preachers of equality. So it's not so much that, they want the BLM or the trans. That's not the point. What he said is he's pulled at their web, right? Remember, that's the beautiful thing about the imagery of the tarantula. They spin a web, right? Web of lies, right? They're spinning this fabrication. And what Zarathustra is saying is, I'm going to poke at their web. In other words, I'm going to say something publicly about BLM, or I'm going to say something about the trannies. And they're going to come out of their hole. And then you're going to have two combatants on the stage, and you're going to know what their motivations are, right? That's more important. It's more important to know what your opponent's motivations are than to simply know that they're an opponent. And what Zarathustra says fundamentally guides the motivations of these people, like we would say the BLM and the trannies, is simple resentment that there are people different than them. They cannot abide that there are people different than them, and possibly better in some ways than them. That's what they absolutely cannot abide. And again, I think he also primarily has academia in mind here in this chapter, because, well, there's a number of reasons there. But that's going to be the key to understanding this, and then also as well, the literal genealogies that he's given us on the differences between uh, ancient Greek teachings, right, democracy, that kind of equality, and ancient Christianity versus modern Christianity. Those genealogies he gives us are paramount in understanding Nietzsche's position on these things, because, and I have to emphasize this again, when he says that the preachers of equality today, in the form of democracy and Christianity, what he says of them is that they are sons of fathers. And what he says about the fathers is that uh, the sons are rather alien to the fathers. But even more importantly, he says, very often I see the seeds of the father in the son, but not always, right? So it could very well be the case that there are versions of these ancient things that could be, that are not prone to these kinds of critiques. Um, but Zarathustra is very clear when he says more often than not. So he sees it far more the case that they're just simply prone to being hijacked than it is the case that they can stand any kind of legacy. Um, and that's what, I mean. Everyone has. I mean, we've all seen these. There were these. I think the space is still going on. I honestly don't know how long these guys are going to do the space, but for days, right? And that long discussion about the pagans versus the Christians and stuff. So what on Nietzsche's account, Nietzsche is a very subtle thinker, and he's saying it's not of necessity the case that these things can become preachers of equality. Um, it could be the case that they still retain um, their ancient guise, as it were, of burning the heretics, and not just burning the heretics, but being the best at burning the heretics. I mean, my God, I would love to side with Christians who would burn heretics today. I would embrace them like a long lost son embraces his father. I would say, Dad, light me up, baby. Let's go do this. I'm with you, man. I'll carry the gasoline. I'll carry the lit torches. Let's go do this together. Let's bring the cleansing fire of sulfur upon these heretics. How beautiful would that be? And then we'll come to our disagreements later, right? Sort of like that. We'll break bread later and talk about our disagreements, right? I think that would be so great. But even possibly he could be referring to democracy here. I don't. Again, I think in the grand scheme of things, I just don't think that Nietzsche can be reconciled with Christianity or democracy. It's just not there, especially democracy. I mean, he's perfectly clear about aristocracy. Um, he's also perfectly clear about his atheism. But at least for the debates that we see happening in our immediate lives and stuff like that, it is very, very important to recognize that Nietzsche himself understood the subtlety of these things. And he has the respect of the various founders, whether it's Homer for the Greeks or whether it's Christ for the Christians. He has the respect for the founders, at least, to appreciate their greatness. Even if it's going to be the case that somewhere down the line he's fundamentally going to part paths with them. Um, in any case, a number of friends in the audience here. We can open it up now. I didn't want this to go over an hour and a half, and here we are at 2 hours and 10 minutes. But whatever, that's just how these things go, I guess. Um, if and obviously disgraced. I mean, you can take over the discussion altogether if you want. This is really for you as a continuation of that interview that up there at the top, that podcast we did together.
Thank you so much. No, I actually got to run. I'm in suddenly baby care mode here. So thank you so much, though. This was really great. I could, do this all day. I really love unpacking these chapters together. So thank you so much.
What I love hearing in the background is the legacy of disgraced propagandists going forward. So there will be a disgraced propagandist 2.0 at least at some point. So that's wonderful. I love when I hear people in my spaces with kids and families and stuff. I think that's the most wholesome thing possible. The best way to fight against all of this filth that we see around us today is to have prosperous families. No better way whatsoever than to have prosperous families. But yeah,
Right. We should have babies crying all the time, or babies making noise all the time in the background,
This disgrace is becoming disgraced with me. He's like, go easy on the praise there, man. It's been a few days since I've had a solid night's sleep. Get fucked over there, Athenian. But yeah, Uber Boy will go for it, my man.
How you doing, my man? So, I've no babies in the background, but I'm sort of mentally about 4 years old, so that might do it. I have a question I want to ask you. Um, Obviously, Nietzsche gets accused of being a moral relativist. He is getting accused of having no stable values and stuff like this. Now, when I've read through him with my close reading, I've constantly come up with this idea in my head that he is asserting a very firm description of what you could only call as like a good and a bad, in the master morality way of saying things. So he's very like, philosophy of life. He views pagan religions as life religions, which he sort of frames or tones with a positive judgment. He talks about life affirmation and the sort of acknowledgement of nature and the intuitive celebration of nature. He is constantly trying to point out that the thing he doesn't like in Christianity is its life denying essence. But of course, he doesn't necessarily blame Christianity as the absolute evil. Maybe for us it is, but for general world, he's saying that like Buddhism suffers from this as well. Life denial is a problem with Schopenhauer and everything. And is this in my head is forming into a sort of a good and a bad. And then in this phrase, the tarantulas, he has this, I think it's one of the most beautiful phrases he has of all, where he says, "For man to be redeemed from vengeance is for me the bridge to the highest hope and the rainbow after a long, long storm." And you don't really get this motherfucker speaking so kind of calmly and positively and hopefully like that. He's usually just being a prick, He's usually just being a dickhead, putting people down, saying all these nasty things, saying everything you believe is wrong. And then here you have this like beautiful, elegant, almost sensitive lilt that comes out of him. And I think this really captures a really big part of his soul as well. And this is him describing resentment, which I very much think is tied to his philosophy of life denial. He would say that when you experience life and life causes you to suffer, you react to that usually by either resenting life itself or even resenting the specimens of life, the beautiful, the strong, the healthy, the people who are chosen by life, the pro-life people, if you will, or something like this. And so it's almost like he's categorizing resentment as, in some sense, some psychological evil state or dangerous state, a very, very negative state, very close to like an almost absolute bad. Now, of course, it's not an absolute bad. But I'm trying to throw this around in my head and think, like, is this it does would Nietzsche be trying to model this philosophy of resentment as something that's a stable enough value that we can reevaluate all values with and sort of turn around and be like, all right, this is the big bad motherfucker that we need to watch out for. I even think this is so successful that Jordan Peterson has taken this and used it quite successfully and normie pilled an awful lot of people on the danger of like resentment. Even though Jordan Peterson distorts Nietzsche an awful lot, he takes this core idea and he brings it to the masses and it becomes incredibly politically effective. Like Jordan Peterson obviously did red pill an awful lot of people not to listen to like extremists in academia and stuff like this. And so I'm always trying to model this in my head and think about what he might have meant. And I just really want to know your thoughts and how you shape that in your mind.
Yeah, I've been unable to forgive Peterson for his attacks of anonymous Twitter. So that it at this point he's undone, in my mind at least, any good that he's done. But your point is well taken. No, what I would say is this. Um, there's at one point Nietzsche says that he doesn't talk about he phrases it this way, and Nietzsche does this in his own name. It's not even Zarathustra. But he says that he says my virtues are so strict that were I to speak of them, it would just frighten most people away. They would know that they wouldn't be able to live up to it. Um, so the best that we have to do is see what happens in Zarathustra and what kind of the virtues that he talks about in Zarathustra. Now, obviously, the fact that overcoming of the self is something that is always an ongoing process. I mean, he just even said in this chapter that life itself always wants to overcome itself, so that there's a kind of I'm hesitant to say this because I don't like attributing these kind of foundational things we could say to Nietzsche's thought, but there does seem to be a kind of understanding of history itself, insofar as human existence even exists. It's always going to be in such flux that even under the best circumstances, if there was an overman to come, and a reclaiming of the world, right? Because let's be perfectly clear about this. Zarathustra's teaching and Nietzsche's teaching in particular, right, is global. It is atheistic, plain and simple. Now Nietzsche and Zarathustra tinker around with the creation of new gods, right? That's going to explain the occurrence of Dionysus. But it's not anything that he seems to have found uh, satisfactory enough to provide much more about it. This is why I have to go back and find the space where Justin came in. But my friend Justin Gottschalk, he's just so absolutely incredibly knowledgeable at Nietzsche. It's funny. because he's got all the Nachlass memorized in the original German, and he can tell you that, he's like, just it's on the same page. Nietzsche was entertaining these same thoughts at the same time. But what he says is, and I think he's right, is that Nietzsche himself came to understand just how humanly impossible the task of a revaluation of all values is. But that's not to say that it's impossible to start the process. In fact, it's very possible. And in fact, he was very successful at it. He was more successful than he thought in his own lifetime. In the use and disadvantage of history for life, he says, if I had 100 men who read Plutarch, I could overtake the world. Nietzsche didn't need any men. He did it himself. He overtook the world. We are all fundamentally Nietzscheans in some respect. Uh, I always find it funny when I hear people talking about nihilism as if they're not already in some ways infected by it. We all are infected by nihilism from the ground up. We just have to recognize the elements of ourselves that are nihilistic in that way. But that being said, uh, it's a lot like I pointed out in my spaces when I'm reading Zarathustra. Zarathustra, in the very early sections, even with the priest, he does in fact have a teaching of prudence, uh, what he refers to as the gift giving virtue. You simply ask yourself, what does he give and what does he not give? And in the cases that he doesn't give, is it because he's afraid that he's going to take something away that's too fundamental to somebody else? And in fact, that's exactly what he says to the priest. Uh, is that I have to get going now, because if I stay, what do I have to give you, right? Unless I would end up taking something away from you, because um, he's also recognized the ideologue versus someone who has the potential for being educated. The priest fundamentally just batters him up and down. From the moment he sees him, right? It's been 10 years. He's like, and he just immediately starts psychologizing him. And then, all the first words out of Zarathustra's mouth to another man in 10 years is, I love man. And then the priest rips on him about that, or rants at him about that. And it's like, don't do this, don't love them. And so he just sort of goes on his way. But he's able to have a kind of prudence in his speech with him so that he establishes friendship, or a kind of friendship, which is to say he doesn't make an enemy out of him, and he doesn't rob him of the things that are helping him along as his own kind of cane, right? Walking stick is the imagery that he used himself, just in this chapter. Uh, and it seems to me that those understandings of virtue are in fact timeless, right? This understanding of a kind of prudence, right? That's timeless. Now, justice as a prudence, or I'm sorry, justice as a virtue, that's going to be quite different, right? That's obviously something that's always seems to be changing. Uh, and in fact, those two camps of virtue are what are at stake in these two chapters, the practical and the theoretical element of preachers of equality, right? The rabble on the one hand, and then the tarantulas on the other. But the fact that someone still has an understanding of justice, which is to say, that which is fitting to someone based upon some kind of criteria, that goes unchanged, right? That seems to be stable within the flux. There's something about the nature of, well, Nietzsche certainly wouldn't say the nature of human beings, right? The word nature is only mentioned once in the entire book. Now, bad translators have fucked that up, but it's only mentioned once, and it's mentioned in a derogatory way precisely because Nietzsche finds that to be the most problematic thing about the history of Western philosophy. One could say, I mean, look, that's what we get. That's the very word in the word Aristotle's physics, right? Aristotle's physis, and the metaphysics, metaphysis, right? That word physis is nature, and so that's why he has such disdain for it, because it's led people astray. But he does say that being, which is a fundamental becoming, is fundamentally innocent. And that's a boon for Nietzsche because it means we can stamp our own values on things going forward. That's how we can, in fact, institute this revaluation of all values, if it's possible, right? If it's possible. Um, And so these concepts of what is fitting for someone based upon a certain criteria, that's unchanging. And Nietzsche, in no way, this is what's funny because it's I don't speak Russian, and I'd love to check this in Dostoevsky. But one line that is common to both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky is the claim of about nihilism being that if nothing is forbidden, then everything is permitted. Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism is far more subtle and complex than that. What that is, in fact, is the vulgar understanding of nihilism. The same way that you have Nietzsche's own teachings being vulgarized by his disciples, they get intermixed, the syncretism going on with these preachers of equality, with the herdman, with the rabble. The same thing happens with nihilism. That's why you see these just ridiculous tweets on the timeline of people saying, "Oh, you're a nihilist," right? As if it's somehow pejorative, because they themselves don't even understand the extent of nihilism. I mean, my God, it's in book 2 of Plato's Republic, book 1 and 2 of Plato's Republic, for God's sake. Um, but that's the thing, is that uh, the vulgar are always going to sort of be looking for these rash accounts of things to say, oh God, that's what it is, my God, and sort of throw their hands up and be outraged. Nietzsche himself is going to say that people who are prone to outrage make for very bad philosophers, very bad students of philosophy, because you have to have something about you that's, in the grand scheme of things, more curious than prone to anger or prone to outrage, something like that. And that's going to be at the heart of establishing virtues that are stable within the flux of being, right? And so that's certainly Nietzsche's understanding of these things. Now, what are those virtues? Uh, well, I actually have a list of them. I've gone through and I have a list of them, and I have the citations where they occur throughout his writings, and those I can provide. In fact, in my Telegram, there's a guy. Uh, he at one point he was president of the Nietzschean Studenten, right? The primary journal of all uh, publications devoted to Nietzsche uh, is the society that at one point he was president of. Um, and I have a couple of his essays that I added into my Telegram, and he goes through as well and does a listing of the various virtues, not to be completely exhaustive, but there is a very wonderful passage in Joyous Science where Nietzsche makes perfectly clear that there is, in fact, a fundamental hierarchy even to the virtues. And it occurs in the most subtle of all ways, which is perfectly fitting for Nietzsche, because even in Zarathustra, he's going to say the greatest events happen on in silence, right? The greatest events that change the world are the ones that most people never even hear. They come on the wing of doves. Uh, that's why he has such disdain for common scribblers, these people who are endlessly writing about contemporary politics, because they've missed the boat. Uh, you really need to be concerned with the things that happened a while back that no one really even paid attention to. That's when things really happened. That's when the world really changed. We're just living in the consequences. And what Nietzsche says in one of the aphorisms of Joyous Science is, he says, when your house is on fire, you don't stop and you know you don't stop to get your coat on the way out. So, in other words, there is a rank ordering even to the virtues that remains stable within the greatest of flux, which is to say, if your house is on fire, you're not going to stop and gather your coat. There's something about uh, salvaging yourself, or to put it in the terms of Twitter, there's something about salvaging your account that's greater than just, you know, doing the kamikaze suicide mission where you don't care if you get banned or whatever. And again, this comes back around to the fact that there is a teaching of prudence in Nietzsche. And the reason I emphasize prudence is because prudence is the most important of all the virtues. If you have prudence, then you, of necessity, are going to have uh, the virtue of wisdom, right? These things are so fundamentally tied together, um, that you can't distinguish them. Because remember, what is prudence? Well, it's this threefold effect of things coming together. It's knowing what to do, knowing when to do it, and then doing it. So there's this, and it all occurs simultaneously, right? So you have the theoretical and the practical inherently built together. This nonsense about, like you find in Kant, for instance, of theoretical writings versus practical writings. That's nonsense. Heidegger skewers this at great length in Being and Time, where he points out that the theoretical and the practical, they're fundamentally combined together. This gets to the core of the so-called hermeneutical circle. But that's what's going on with Nietzsche, is that he does in fact have an account of prudence. He does have these other various virtues. For instance, solitude is a virtue. He does have his virtue of what justice is, which he's just told us is that justice demands inequality. That's going to be one of the most salient features of any kind of understanding of justice that Zarathustra will have anything to do with, is that it has to make room for better and lesser human types. But anyway, that's a really long answer to your question. And we're coming up on 2.5 hours. Look, I've got a number of friends in here. If anyone wants to, and you guys know who you are. If any of you all want to chime in here before I end it, speak now or forever hold your peace, because I'm about to end this one, because the timing turned out that I'm also going to be in a space with some other friends tonight, and I still have to. It's on overcoming nihilism with Dostoevsky, and I have to do a little preparatory reading for some of that stuff. But or I like to imitate Fisher at these moments and say, or I could just end the damn thing. I don't care. I could just end the damn space. I don't care. But anyway, again, this I think these particular chapters in book 2, they really speak to, on the one hand, the fundamental task of political philosophy. And that is always going to be the question of not simply how do you found new modes and orders, to use Machiavelli's teaching. It's not simply to found it, but how do you keep it going afterwards, right? How does the regime stay in order? What keeps it in order? Well, it's always going to be the understanding of justice. And that's what we have here with this rabble, and then especially with the tarantulas. Is Nietzsche's Zarathustra is confronting that head on. And again, this has to do with this problem of syncretism, but especially syncretism of this preaching of equality. And the reason equality seems to be so important, politically speaking, is, again, it comes back around to the psychology of resentment. This is why we say, for instance, a hater's going to hate, right? People see excellence, and the first thing they want to do is attack it, right? They will stand in line around the whole goddamn block to watch you fail. They will not stand by your side to watch you succeed. And that's the power of Nietzsche's psychology here, is he's getting people to recognize, he's saying, you think that you're immune from resentment, but let me tell you about your ideals of egalitarianism. Let me tell you about the motives behind your most fundamental institutions of religion, your deepest understandings of what you think the Greeks taught. Uh, you're so full of resentment at the fact that superiority can exist and not have touched you, that you will not even be able to recognize your own father. Your father being, of course, the ancient versions of democracy, the ancient versions of Christianity. That's what he's getting at. And when you recognize just how powerful that is, you really have to sit back and say, holy shit, man, because these things do infect us. It is the case, for instance, that a lot of times when I go to the gym, and I'll see like some younger guy, and the first thing I'll think to myself is, I bet when I was his age, I actually looked better than him. That's the sort of the first place your mind goes, because it's like you want so desperately to kind of somehow validate yourself or something like that. Shit, Uber, I wasn't even looking at the screen. I didn't realize you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
What's going on here now? Um, So on your point there, because you brought up politics, I was sort of asking maybe before about personal resentment. I really read big into this, by the way. Nietzsche's psychology of resentment. I think Nietzsche as a psychologist might be one of his strongest suits. Keith Woods actually reached out to me recently, and he wants to talk a little bit about like metaphysics in relationship to Nietzsche. And I've also noticed when I talk to Christians, they are always saying like they want to talk about Nietzsche on the metaphysical level because that's where they feel comfortable. That's what they think Nietzsche is wrong about and all this stuff. And I don't really like Nietzsche's metaphysics are absolutely schizo, so I don't know them too well myself. And it's kind of true. You're kind of like fighting from a difficult corner sometimes. But his psychology side of things is just so profound and deep. He is so correct. He is so accurate. I actually find it such a pity that Western culture moved towards Freud and Jung as psychologists, as the foundation of how we started to see psychology, compared to Nietzsche, because the potential inside Nietzsche is monumental. And one of the core parts of this is this categorization of resentment. It's such a big deal. And it relates to almost everything I see him talk about. Like the master and slave morality thing is so tied up with the idea of resentment. How, you know, these slaves resent the masters. The masters are forgetful because they're powerful. They don't understand resentment. And then the slaves are obviously crafty. And they actually, in some sense, have virtues like prudence, which Nietzsche noted, and they can like kind of plan long term and be cruel long term and stuff like this. And this really directly plays then into the political stuff, which I think is fascinating, where the problem that Nietzsche is pointing out across all these institutions in history, all these regimes in history, is that a minority always has to rule. The masters are always going to be smaller than the slaves, I guess you could say. The Spartans and the Helots are always going to have this relationship. And the problem is that there's going to be this big batch of underlings, of an underclass of some sort, and they are never going to be happy with their situation, and they're always going to be driven frenzied by resentment and bitterness and aggression and nastiness. I know this, I'm Irish, so like I live among this type of stuff, and they're always going to hate the conqueror. And this is a very serious problem for the like stabilities of regimes and orders, because you can never create something sort of everlasting, because Nietzsche even says this in Genealogy of Morals: the weak are too many, they are the majority, and they will pull everything down eventually, because their resentment is more motivating to them than the master's comfort and pleasure, especially like with 3 or 4 generations into the masters securing their status in the world and whatnot. And I've kind of wondered like what you're supposed to do with that, because you look at Roman Christianity motivated by resentment, and I like drove into Rome, and in some sense, all right, this is the narrative I was saying there earlier on the timeline, drove into Rome, and in some sense, like took it over like a communist revolution, and ran the thing into the ground essentially. And the kind of question is, it's like, you know, you're like, oh, that's so terrible, the big based Romans, but it's like, well, what could the Romans do? You read about this, and this is definitely a part of it, the story that these resentful Christian anarchists in some sense were doing this. But you read about the Roman traditionalist pagans, and they're sort of like reading about conservacux nowadays. You know, they're all pathetic, they're wimps, they don't stand up for Rome. They a load of them actually convert to Christianity in the end and become like monks and stuff like this, because it's sort of like a hippie movement and stuff like that. And you kind of think to yourself, it's like, how can anything stay stable? How can anything stay permanent? How can anything lift up to these like incredible heights and overcome resentment in a permanent way and create something that's like beautiful and everlasting? And I guess the point I'm trying to get to with this, and the point I'm always pondering about, is that is Nietzsche trying to say that resentment needs to be something that needs to be confronted, and you need to get a SWAT team of elite motherfuckers who understand resentment as the big bad enemy, and then try to attack it as clearly as they can, and just be very conscious that that's the bad guy that's there? Or would we look for something that is psychologically disabling of resentment? In fact, you could say Christianity does that in some sense. Christianity is a religion that gets like stops people from being resentful because it makes them project it into Christ. And Buddhism maybe does this a little bit as well. But the point being is that it's like these religious mechanisms get rid of that resentment, and that kind of saves the problem for the masters, for the rulers, or whatever. These are just some of my thoughts on this. They're not really the best form that they could be, but it's something I find very interesting.
Yeah, um, I don't know how far down that that train of thought I can follow you, just because I have my own interpretation of what happened with Rome that I think really follows Nietzsche's understanding of master slave morality uh, more persuasively. And I did a few spaces on this. It really comes back around to uh, how he understands Shakespeare, and particularly the Roman trilogies, uh, Julius Caesar at one point. But um, uh, Antony and Cleopatra is really where you see it happen. Nietzsche never really talks about how the master slave dynamic works itself out. He gives us the categories of it, uh, but he, but then he switches over in book three and says this is really just a commentary on Zarathustra. And what I think you see within, for instance, the final of the Roman trilogy with Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra, what you have is Barbarous, the sort of the slave, delivers the message to Antony and says Rome thinks that they're being led by a woman, and what you have there is sort of the secret to the master slave dynamic is that the slaves, it's not that the slaves ever really overtake the masters. What happens is that the masters take on the characteristics of the slaves. And so that's how and then once the masters have taken on the characteristics of the slaves, that's when the revaluation becomes institutionalized because they make it common. So, for instance, when you hear people talk about the so-called elites today, uh, I mean, just think about something like, I don't know, like Joe Biden with his son. Uh, these people are not elites, right? They're degenerates. They've just found a way to institutionalize their degeneracy. They've taken the most vulgar understandings of virtue that we could possibly imagine, and they live it every day of their life. It's like, which underage ethnic girl is Hunter Biden sniffing cokes right off her ass today? I don't know, right? These kind of things. But that being said, um, I think that, well, I don't know. I mean, I think I just sort of might have to leave it at that. But I'm not saying that you're wrong. I just want to emphasize that I'm saying that my interpretation goes in a very different direction than yours on that.
Sweet. I know
But
you're a little bit pressed for time, but I'd actually love to know like exactly what you think is different because I'm really open to being challenged. Like I don't know for anybody here who hasn't seen it, I basically like put out a thread the other day, got like 1 million views. I basically said Christianity was Rome's woke movement, and throwed a couple of facts I know from the Christian movement, where, for example, it was very urban. And the pagans were very rural at the time, and it kind of reflects the conservative movement versus the liberals and stuff like this. But obviously, it's not the entire description of exactly what happened. It was done in like 6 tweets in a thread or something like this. And since then, I've actually been reading a couple of things that people have suggested, like the Last Pagan and all that. But Athenian, I'd love to know like where you differ and like, what exactly you think went different, because you said there the masters took on their values, and I actually think there's definitely some truth to that. But maybe if you have time, you could expand on it.
yeah, it's funny because I'm one of my mutuals. I don't know if he's in here right now, but Grill. My phone's lighting up with messages from one of the chats that Grill's in, and the stuff they're talking about. I'm trying not to laugh because it's like Jesus, guys. But yeah, look. As far as this is the one thing I would caution about that last thing that even brought this whole topic up that you mentioned, the so-called metaphysics in Nietzsche. Uh, we have to be careful talking about metaphysics and Nietzsche because that's all Heideggerian. Heidegger was the one who said that Nietzsche remained embedded in metaphysics. Nietzsche himself does not see himself in any metaphysics whatsoever. He's done away with being altogether. And in fact, he psychologized being. He said the belly of being, and this is in Zarathustra, he says the belly of being does not speak to man except as being, uh, or as body, right? As the belly. So I made this tweet and it fell completely flat about borborygmi, which is the medical term for hunger pains, right? When your stomach growls. I said that Nietzsche effectively calls metaphysicians the Borborygmi kings, and that's sort of what it is. Now, Heidegger writes an awful lot about Nietzsche, and he says that Nietzsche remains embedded in metaphysics, and in fact, he goes one step further, and in his book, What is Called Thinking, he says that Nietzsche is in fact the culmination of the entire tradition of metaphysics. Um, and all I will really say about Heidegger on Nietzsche is that um, he does great violence to Nietzsche, but that's not to say that he shouldn't be read. I mean, Heidegger is a primary philosopher in his own right, so Heidegger's secondary literature has become primary literature, and it's worth reading. It's just that you won't find really Nietzsche and Heidegger. You're just going to find Heidegger's Nietzsche and Heidegger. I think that Nietzsche is fundamentally a psychologist in the Platonic sense. He's not a metaphysician, and what I mean by that is that at the very end of the first book of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche famously says, now I'm going to return the fundamental questions back to psychology. So, what he means by that is that the fundamental questions, being itself, right? All of the fundamental questions: what is man? What is substance? What does it mean to know? All of these fundamental questions Nietzsche understands through the psychological lens. And that's what we're really getting with Zarathustra, is these various accounts of the drives, that sort of thing. And you're exactly right, though. It's the reason that the world has not been thoroughly influenced by Nietzsche is because he was too good. Uh, when you take your understanding of human psychology and you're able to find within it something that really sort of defines history itself. That's the whole point of the genealogy of morality. It's offering a new history of Western philosophy. That's the whole point of Nietzsche's understanding of psychology, is that is the engine that drives what we call history itself. The problem with that is that Nietzsche takes it and says, you know what, this could actually work to our benefit if we make it global and we make sure that it stays atheistic. Uh, and in fact, we make sure that it returns to aristocracy. That's where academia had to not go, because they couldn't. And precisely because of all of the reasons that we're exploring here in these two chapters, is that too there's too much resentment involved in these institutions of ours, whether it's government, whether it's academia, that are too heavily invested in their understanding of equality, which is to say, certain levels of resentment that would literally upend the entire world order, if they were to go down the road of saying, you know what, Nietzsche is actually better than Freud. He's deeper. For instance, read Civilization and Its Discontents, right? Freud's account of his understanding of psychology written large. Read that and then compare that to Zarathustra. It's like comparing a child's writing to a genuine philosopher. And unfortunately, one of those makes room for all of the kind of egalitarianism and such, that the Western world order can still retain its stability. Uh, the if you turn everything into sex like Freud does, then you still get to keep Western civilization. If you turn everything into will to power like Nietzsche does, you have to be uh, made, well, as the Germans would say, verboten, forbidden. Can't talk about that. Oh God, fascism. Oh no. Oh no. Right? It's like, oh no, you're fascist, right? Or oh, you're a Nazi, something like that, right? And that's why, in the grand scheme of things, one could even say that with Nietzsche, even his teaching uh, was lives up to precisely what he says about great events in Zarathustra. They happen and no one notices. The greatest event of, we could say, modern world history, postmodern world history, is Nietzsche's teaching. And in fact, it's so powerful that it doesn't even get to be talked about. Really, they can't talk about it in academia. You can't openly be a Nietzschean and be in Western politics. I mean, you just can't. They would shun you from the beginning. I mean, it would be like just committing suicide. So Nietzsche's own teaching lives up and proves, in fact, that his teaching is in fact right about at least the greatest world events and things like that. Um, but anyway, again, another really long answer to some of your short questions. But I got to call it. We got to call it a day here on this one because I have about an hour or so to shove some food down my gullet, and then hop into a great space with Astral and Gifts on overcoming nihilism tonight. Um, but anyway, always love having you in here with me, Uber Boyle. This is great. And I recommend everyone follow Uber Boyle, even if he gets extremely provocative on the timeline like that. I mean, we'd be wasting our time if we weren't provocative, right? I mean, why be here and just be a lemming?
I mean, I actually sent the fucking place into meltdown. I'm like still getting DMs. I got like half of India following me, man. I was like, all the Indian bros. I've got this army of Indian soldiers now. Where basically like Christianity is like they're trying to, the Judeo Christianity is trying to get us, the Hindus, and trying to take down the Hindu religion. I'm like, all right, lads, let's go, let's go. So
Yeah, just wait till what happens over the weekend, right? When everyone has more time to get on Twitter and everyone's gonna see it. It's gonna
oh
it's
dear,
it's gonna keep going.
oh dear.
So that's a good thing,
If
though.
I could just put just one final thing that you said that I do think is a very very interesting side of Nietzsche, because that idea that Nietzsche is the psychologist is maybe under stressed an awful lot. I think this is very true. Like I initially got into Jung and actually read an awful lot of Freud, and I quite like Freud. I think Freud is a very smart dude. You know, and he's obviously extremely intelligent, very perceptive. He does come up with a couple of wacky things, but nonetheless, he's very very good. But when I read Nietzsche, I started to realize it's like, fuck, this dude Freud just ripped all of this stuff from Nietzsche. And then you even hear stories like apparently Freud had notes in his diary about like, he had Nietzsche quotes and stuff like this and paragraphs from Nietzsche in his diary. And then Jung and all these lads would ask him, it's like, so have you read Nietzsche? And Freud would be like, I never even heard of him. So you're kind of like, there's something that kind of dodgy going on there too. But I think it does come down to that idea that you're saying that what do you describe as like the fundamental driving passions inside of us, and maybe Freud is a little bit downward focused. He's very sort of like the libido, which is definitely a real phenomenon, but Freud doesn't have this like creative side to it. In fact, the reason why I got into Jung is because Jung speaks far more like an artist about how our passions work and how we've got these like internal drives that would make us sacrifice sex for the sake of painting a fucking lovely picture and all that. Like, how does that make any rational sense? And I really look at Nietzsche and I think if you grab the core energy that he represents, he's like one of the first guys in a modern sense to psychologize that, to sit down and say we have this like vitalistic, creative, high, ambitious energy inside of ourselves. We have these literal like burning passions inside of ourselves that if you express them properly, they create great art, they create great things, they create heroism and whatnot. And then with this whole psychology of resentment, that's almost like a psychologization of one of the lowest emotions inside of us. And I guess
Hang on. Now, Richard, I know you can be controversial, so I'm gonna trust you to not be controversial here. But I just want to say, just do me a favor and just kind of mute while Uber Boy is talking because we're getting a lot of feedback there.
are we good?
All right, good deal.
Are we good?
All right, good deal.
I'll try.
Okay.
I'll try wrap it up as fast as possible. But as I was saying, like Jung had that sort of creative, ascendant, vitalistic perspective, and Nietzsche really captured that as well. I think this is one of the very powerful sides of him, is that he's talking about these emotions inside of us. We have these big passions. They create all the high art, all these type of things. And then when he talks about resentment, he's almost categorizing a lower passion inside of us. He's talking about how we have these ugly feelings that pull us downwards. And these are, when he says overcome, I really think this is a big part of it. So that side of him, I don't think is focused on enough. I notice an awful lot of people talk about him like philosophy sells, which I understand. I think he's like got a great like world modeling side of himself. But this psychological part is incredibly powerful and very, very overlooked. And I know an awful lot of people from the psychology game, like, because I was into Jung and I talked about him an awful lot on YouTube and stuff like this, and none of them read Nietzsche because he's too scary, and they always actually try to psychoanalyze him and say that he was like a diseased weirdo and stuff like this. So that's the sort of thing. But I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, you get a lot of people who think that biography is the same as philosophy, and so they just dismiss Nietzsche based on the things about his involvement with one particular woman, or the so-called the claims of the sexually transmitted diseases or whatever. But that's just stupid. Well, all right. So this is a big deal. I've not had you in any of my spaces before, Richard. So thank you. I'm going to trust you to let's not get too provocative or something. So go ahead, please.
Well, are you guys Nietzscheans or are you not? You're warning me about being provocative. What kind of space is this?
Well,
no, I know what you're.
No, that's no,
I know what
you're exactly right. I'm just saying for the preservation of my account. That's
totally understand, but maybe you misjudged me just a little bit, but that's all right. Yeah, I've enjoyed the discussion. I've listened to about an hour of it while I've taken a walk. I would just like to add one thing that I think is frequently missed when people discuss the master and slave dialectic. And so I think an irony is missed that kind of comes at the end of the discussion, which is that, yes, the master is the blonde beast and he enjoys himself, and whatever is healthy and victorious is good, and whatever is weak and sick is bad, and all that kind of stuff. The slave flips that on its head, and he begins to theorize that what is vital and healthy and domineering, etc., is evil, and what is meek and weak is good. And that's all very true, and I think a lot of people will get that. Now, with Nietzsche, one irony that's lost in a lot of people is that I think there's no way out but through with him. I don't think Nietzsche is really counseling us to become blonde beast or something. I don't think he thinks that's even possible. There's a level at which the slave, to give the devil his due, made us deep and made us understand irony, and in some ways created a figure like Nietzsche himself, who is highly analytical, highly ironic. You know, in some moods he can be bombastic, in other moods he can be, joyful and visionary. In other moods he can be kind of playful and feminine, or like he's writing a bunch of, op-eds against various thinkers he doesn't like. So I think there's an irony that is missed, in the sense that he's not counseling that we return to being blonde beasts. I don't think there's any possibility of like ejecting Christianity from our psyche or going backwards in time, which is something he also counsels against. I think we have to kind of go through it. And there's a kind of blessing, so to speak, of the victory of the slave over the master, in the sense that we became deep and we understood irony and psychology, maybe on a deeper level. So anyway, I just wanted to add that into the discussion.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the exact line, but there's one point where he says exactly that it's with man that, oh God, I'm forgetting the line, but he says it's only now that man has become deep, and I think that the recognition of just how bad uh, humanity can become by way of this possibility of the last man is in fact a catalyst, like what you're saying, to recognize uh, the greatness that could also be afoot, right? One doesn't simply fall into being the last man. These are things that take millennia to build up to, and in many ways completely unwittingly, right? I mean, they rush towards something thinking it's so great, only to find out that it's been their downfall. And so
Yeah.
experiencing that crisis.
And
Yeah, go
remember,
ahead.
the last man is also kind of a doppelganger or like flip side of Nietzsche himself. I mean, when the concept of the death of God is introduced in the gay science, there's this, and you can see echoes of this in Zarathustra as well in book one, where the last man knows that God is dead. He just doesn't care. Like the last man isn't even, an American evangelical Christian, clinging to his guns and Bibles or whatever. Like the last man is actually more sophisticated, and he's kind of imbibed the death of God on his own terms. Now, that's not to say that Nietzsche views that as something good or anything like that. I mean, I agree that the last man is almost like the most horrifying vision that Nietzsche has. It's not that we'll all go extinct or nuclear Armageddon or something. It's that we would all like go to Walmart or something. And that's a particularly kind of Nietzschean, turn. But the last man it's some, I think you have to be specific. I think the last man is something. He's someone very modern, and it's someone who's kind of taken in half of Nietzsche's own wisdom, and I think that's almost what makes him the problem that he is.
Yeah, what I was getting at in some of the spaces I did before on Zarathustra is that um, what the one specific thing that most people just sort of home in on this last man, but in the speech that Zarathustra gives about the last man, he's very, very precise about what it is that makes the last man the last man, and it's Bildung, it's his education. It's squarely his education, and so the thing in which seems to be the anchor of all that comes tumbling out of this last man phenomena is education, and so in that respect, uh, what your point about understanding half of Nietzsche, right? Just only going down part of the road is in fact the problem. It's definitive of the problem. Um, let's see. Hold on, Uber Boyo. I think you wanted to go again, and then I'm gonna have to wrap it up. I wish you guys had come in earlier. I should have asked for people to hop in
We're gonna
earlier. But
we're
go
gonna
ahead, Uber.
ensnare you
Go
here.
ahead.
You're trapped. You're trapped in the tarantulas web, man. That's what's going on here. I actually want to speak to something that Richard brought up there at the very very start, because I find this side of things fascinating. I was speaking about this psychological mechanisms that Nietzsche detects, the way he's just so perceptive to see this stuff. And this is something that you constantly see as a motif throughout his works and his writings. He's very good at seeing all sides of an argument, and he's constantly giving props to the slaves, to the weak, for the virtues that they develop as a consequence of their weakness. In fact, like one of the famous things he says about the Jews, who are he calls like the people who basically master the ability to think like slaves. He says that through this they gain some of the most powerful virtues. They're some of the most psychologically vital people in existence as a consequence of stuff like this. He points out how the masters have downsides. They have bad things. One of the masters' problems is forgetfulness, is naivety. Specifically, they become delusional and out of touch with reality. Now, this is of course tied up with their happiness and tied up with their ability to act on instinct, but it is also a downside. Then you see very specifically with the slaves that they become hyper conscious. They develop, as you said, the Athenian, they develop that depth. They develop the ability to think. They develop a conscience. They develop self reflection. They develop long-term thinking. They develop actually many virtues, patience above all, as a consequence of this. I remember reading through Nietzsche, and like over the last couple of years, these type of passages are very shocking. But he would talk about the Germans and how they're too impulsive, and he would say that the people he'd bet on as the great important tides of history would be the Russians and the Jews, because of the fact that they've just got so much inbuilt patience inside of them, pointing out to this more slavish virtue as being so good. The craftiness of this as well. And again, he also talks constantly about how history would be boring were it not for the weak, trying to come up with alternate strategies. Almost like you go out into nature and you see this really weird fucking plant or this animal, like a parasite, That's such a weird entity. Why not just be a lion? That's a way more proud way to operate. But the parasite has figured out an interesting way to make it through the world. The sloth, the whale, like there's all these interesting alternate strategies that the weak figure out, the slaves figure out. And I remember even like again to this idea that we're not going to be we're not going to be the blonde beast. Is it even possible? Can we become the masters? He would talk about us as unarguably being crafted by Christianity, and you could even say this sort of slave morality of democracy or whatever you want to call it. But we are this sort of hyper intellectual, conscious, overconscious entity. We sort of have psychology installed inside of us at this point, and we have self-reflection and a conscience. And I think what he was saying about the Ubermensch is that we have, with this ability to think long form, this craftiness that we've kind of bullied into ourselves, and this unified focus that we've got because of Christianity as well. That maybe that's a terrible thing that made us like less healthy or something like this. It made us less specimens, less beautiful. But nonetheless, that can still be leveraged to an advantage, and we could use that to try tame ourselves and then direct all of our focuses towards something that's ideal and higher and good. And I find those one of the most subtle and compelling parts of the way he thinks about these things.
I just want to be on record as saying how hilarious it is that Uber Boyo takes the mic and starts saying "Jew, Jew, Jew." I'm like, my God, man, what are you trying to do to me? What are you trying to do to me?
Well, I'm not. No, come on. I'm not saying anything like bad about the Jews. I'm basically just reading Nietzsche quotes.
I know, I know. No, I know, and I want to emphasize that because again, this just emphasizes that Nietzsche was absolutely correct when he said that he's dynamite. Look at all the things he touched on. I mean, something we haven't even talked about that he does touch on that really sealed his fate, certainly in academia, is he does in fact talk about eugenics. Uh, Absolutely talks about it. So he is dynamite. He is TNT. These kind of things. But look, guys, this was an amazing space. I had a lot of people requesting. I'm sorry I wasn't able to give everyone a mic. It's just that we've been doing this for like 2.5 hours now, and I absolutely have to get some preparation done for another space here in about an hour or so, and I still have to eat. So it'll be an accomplishment if I can pull off not sounding like a moron in the next space, having spent myself on this one. But always appreciate all of you guys coming in and listening and participating. This is good stuff. I just love whenever we get to have these serious conversations without having any kind of trolls or anything like that. But anyway, so good one. And hopefully, if you guys tune in tonight to the one that Astral and Gifts have a disagreement about whether or not you can, in fact, have this return to a kind of innocence or something like that. Once you've confronted nihilism, can you regain innocence that may be the very precondition to having to have lost to go through nihilism? I will. I have a Nietzschean answer. I have Nietzsche's answer for that, which I'll provide in there. It turns out that the answer, at least from Nietzsche, is yes and no, which just adds to how complex of a thinker he is and how subtle of a thinker he is. But anyway, I hope everyone's having a great week. I mean, the fuck is it? Like what, Tuesday, Wednesday? I don't even know at this point. Thursday? Who knows? But I hope everyone's having a good week, and I'll see you again here in a little bit. So take care.